Okay, folks, that's us. So can I call for the sederent and apologies, please, Stuart?
Thank you, Chair. So Councillor Lillian Jones.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor David Richardson.
Present.
Councillor. Yep, thank you. Councillor Stephen Canning. Present. Yep, thank you. Councillor James Adams. Councillor Adams. Okay. Councillor Peter Mabin.
Yeah, I'm here.
Thank you. Councillor Beverly Clark.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Sally Cogley.
Yes,
Councillor
I'm here. Yes.
Yep, thank you. I have an apology from Councillor William Lennox. Councillor June Kyle.
Present, but I'll make my apologies. I have to leave at 11:15.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Neil Watts.
Present.
Thank you. And Councillor Jennifer Hogg.
Present.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stuart. Okay. Declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? No. Okay. And so with that, we'll move to item 2, the previous minutes. So, David, do we take advice on the previous minutes?
Obviously there's been a change of membership, but standing orders do actually provide that any member can move and any member can second a minute for accuracy. That is a kind of save-all provision just for situations like this. So obviously the normal practice is that it is members who were in attendance that would move minutes, but the standing orders do allow for this kind of situation, which only tends to arise after the election in this period. So it's open to any member. Obviously as officers, we present them and believe they are accurate from the last meeting. We wouldn't put them in front of the committee otherwise, but as a formality it is for the committee to approve their own minutes as opposed to council. So we're inviting probably yourself, Chair, but any member to move the minutes on that basis, recognising the advice that's been given, and we're relying on standing orders. And it's quite clear that I think none of the members now were on the previous committee. Sorry, not quite. We do have one or two. Councillor Cogley, I think, certainly. So if there is a member who has survived from the last membership, it would be better if they want to move it, but anyone can technically move it and second it. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sally?
Yes, I've survived and I'm happy to move the minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally, and I'm so glad you survived the last 5 years. So yeah, and I'll second that. Okay. Okay, so item 3, external audit report on the audit dimensions and best value for the year ended 31st of March 2022. I'll hand over to Joe. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members, and I'll shortly hand across to our external audit manager, Caroline Watt from Deloitte, who's on screen and will join this report shortly. Essentially, members, as you would imagine, a council this size and any public sector body has an external auditor. They're appointed independently of the council. Our internal auditors are colleagues from Deloitte. They've been with us for the last 6 years. We have an excellent relationship with Caroline, with Pat, and with the local audit team. It is their job to work alongside my staff and Aileen Mackay's staff and relevant colleagues in order to review a number of practices and operations within the council. As you can see from the covering report, Caroline and her team have looked at a whole number of areas, including financial management, financial sustainability, governance, transparency and value for money. And in doing so, have concluded that the council continues to have a strong financial management, budget setting and monitoring arrangements in place, along with strong leadership and robust arrangements in place to secure best value. As you would imagine, because of the evolving nature of external audit, Caroline has picked up some other areas, particularly in climate change, which she'll take us through. But on the whole, just want to say that we have a really excellent relationship with colleagues from Deloitte. They will leave us later this year. Caroline and her team will come back in September following the conclusion of the annual accounts audit. And at that point, Deloitte, the MIT office and Audit Scotland will be with us as our external auditors for the next 5 years after September. Chair, with your approval, I'll stop there and hand across to Caroline.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Caroline?
Yeah, and thanks, Joe, and thanks, Chair. Yeah, as Joe said, this is our report on the wider scope audit dimensions. I suppose, given that there's quite a number of new members, just as a bit of a refresh for members that haven't been on the committee before, our audit plan was submitted to the committee back in April, and that set out our plan. So there's two aspects of our audit. There's the financial statement side, and then there's what we describe as the wider scope side. So this report's covering the wider scope elements, and also covers our responsibilities in relation to best value. The key messages are set out on pages 3 and 4, with more detail in the main body of the report. I'll take the report as read, but just sort of highlight some of the key messages under each of the headings. So taking financial management first, we've concluded that the Council continues to have a strong financial management, budget setting and monitoring arrangements in place, and is supported with an experienced finance team and a robust internal audit function. So no issues identified from that particular area. On financial sustainability, we're looking here at both at the short term and the medium to longer term. So as the Council set a balanced budget for 22-23 and has a level of unearmarked reserves within the level set within the reserve strategy, we're satisfied that the financial sustainability in the short term, there's no issues there. However, significant challenges remain over the medium to longer term, with the estimated gap of 115 million by 2031-32. We're pleased to note that there is plans in place to update the medium-term financial plan and the strategic plan, and the creation of the PMO is also a good step forward and help us sort of drive forward that change. This is where we see the most significant risk, but I suppose just as reassurance to members, it is something that we see across all of our public sector bodies, so East Ayrshire Council is not alone in having these particular challenges. On governance and transparency, we've concluded that the Council continues to have a strong leadership and robust governance arrangements in place and continue to be open and transparent. And in terms of the management structure, pleased to note the conclusion of the review of the senior management structure and that creation of the PMO, just to demonstrate the Council's commitment to that continuous improvement journey. On value for money, here we've concluded, similar to previous years, the Council continues to have a clear and robust performance management framework in place, with regular reporting on performance coming to members. So based on all those sort of 4 dimensions, we're satisfied that the Council has sufficient arrangements in place to secure best value and has a clear understanding of what areas require further development. We've continued to monitor the progress in relation to the best value report, which was done back in 2018. So on pages 25 and 26, there's an update there in terms of where things are with the recommendations that came out of that report. Under emerging issues, we recognise that climate change is becoming more and more at the forefront of discussions across all organisations. And Audit Scotland had published a report drawing together some of the key themes identified across a lot of different publications, in particular recommendations for Scotland. So we've summarised those on pages 27 and 20 to 29. And really, we just encourage the Council to review that and carry out a bit of a self-assessment to see where you are in terms of some of the points and develop any action plans if there is areas that require further focus. It's more just to sort of point it in the right direction, because there's so much information out there in terms of that. And then in the appendices, we've included a summary of Audit Scotland's recent Local Government in Scotland Overview report, which again included some key recommendations, which were sort of general for councils across the whole of Scotland. So again, we'd encourage the Council to take these forward if not done so already. And the final point, we've also included a summary and a link to a Deloitte Insight report around infrastructure trends, which we thought it might be useful, just helpful for the Council to refer to that, and if that might be useful to read as background knowledge. That's really all in terms of the report. I'm happy to take any questions any members have.
Okay, Sally, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I just want to focus on the climate change point, and my concern with climate change is that we make some bold statements, but we don't actually specify how we're going to achieve the targets that we have set ourselves. So, for example, and I'll just raise two points here, where we're looking at removing gas central heating and where we're putting gas boilers into houses, what is the plan to actually achieve that? Because I don't think, in practical and pragmatic terms, I think that we need to have concrete plans as to how we're going to achieve these goals, because the terminology that I see is quite vague. It's, yes, there's a target, but that there is no mechanism included within that as to how we're going to achieve it. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that you can provide the answer to this, but I'm just raising it as a concern. So that's just in that one specific bit in relation, for example, to gas central heating. And then secondly, in relation to landfill, again, we have a target of 0 landfill, and I can't remember what the date is for that. I'm sure somebody will put me right on that. But how are we actually going to get there? Because we still know that probably 50% of our constituents don't even recycle properly. So to move from getting people to recycle properly and to use the waste management systems that we currently have in place to achieving 0 landfill, I think that the gap is absolutely enormous. And I don't see a programme in place for achieving that. And so I really just wish to register this as a concern. Thank you.
Okay, Joe, can you come in and answer Sally's points?
Through you, Chair, I can come in and give a brief overview, but conscious that I'll take those points, Councillor Cogley, back to relevant colleagues. But, you know, from the meetings I've been in around climate change and the targets that are set nationally, before we touch on low targets, then they tend to be set and then we then go back to ask about funding to meet those targets. Those discussions around funding are still taking place. Locally, though, in terms of the replacement of the gas central heating, I think it's a point we are taking forward. Andrew Kennedy, Facilities and Property Management, and I'll get him to come back to you on the specific plan. But I know, for example, he's speaking with British Gas colleagues around hydrogen being available in a certain part of the Moorfield area as a test, as a pilot, that would be some way to facilitating that transfer from gas into hydrogen. That would seem to be the most cost-effective way of maintaining that, or that replacement programme. And in terms of landfill, you're absolutely right. There is targets set. I think it's 2025, although I'll check that with Blair and come back to you. But that process itself is a stop date. There is no alternative beyond that date. And, you know, we can see various proposals around alternatives to landfill. Part of that, you're absolutely right, involves redirecting from a residual bin into recycle bins. And, you know, this part of the budget this year and the previous year's budget, there was a mechanism in there in funding available to try and promote particularly recycling of food waste. But in terms of that landfill, you know, we have, you'll hear shortly about the contractor who will be responsible for the next 2 years for our waste disposal contract. And within that contract, there is mechanisms in place to have an alternative to landfill, indeed quite a significant alternative to landfill. We have to also be aware of the more recent things that happened in relation to the Scottish Government's announcement around the moratorium on the heat process in terms of recycling that residual waste. But again, we're in negotiations, Blair and others in negotiations with the Scottish Government, what that actually means. But in terms of those 2 points, I hope that provides an overview, but I'll take them away through you, Chair, and come back to Councillor Cogley and all members of the committee.
Thanks, Joe, that would be helpful. Is that all right, Sally? Do you want to come back in? Happy with that, that's fine. Okay. Are there any more questions or points that members want to ask or raise? Okay. Moving on. So it's item 4. Oh, yeah. Carolyn, we'd just like to thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Carolyn, and for your report. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
So our internal audit report, item 4.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members. And for those of you who haven't met me before, I'm Ailey Mackay, the Council's Chief Auditor. It's lovely to see you this morning. I'm very glad that Carolyn highlighted an aspect of the Deloitte report that indicated that the Council has a robust internal audit function. So I will now try and demonstrate that through my reports and give you examples of how we've managed to meet that badge from external audit, which is one we're very proud of. So if we start with the internal audit annual report for 21-22, and I've deliberately set out more detail in this report than perhaps I would have with the last committee, because I think it's important that we have the chance to inform members of the way in which we work, as well as what we've actually done in 21-22. So if I start with paragraphs 3 and 4, members will note that we brought a summary annual report to committee in April, and that was for a very specific purpose. That was to meet the obligations to inform the Council's annual governance statement, which you know forms part of the annual accounts for the Council. And part of that governance statement reflects the annual opinion that I have to write for the Council, and that's a statutory obligation. So every year I have to prepare an annual opinion reflecting the Council's governance, risk and internal control framework. So this report before you today picks up the key aspects of that report that committee considered on the 21st of April, and particularly the annual opinion, which is presented at Appendix 6, but it also includes additional detailed information on the work that we did during 21-22, and that's in line with our regulatory requirements. So if I can just highlight some of that information for you, members. Paragraphs 6 to 8 lay out some flexibility that we have potentially in preparing the annual opinion. At the start of COVID, the internal audit world was actually very quick to put arrangements in place to recognise that some internal audit teams might not be able to work in the way that they normally work. And that happened in a number of councils in Scotland. In some councils, the internal audit teams were taken off their internal audit work and taken into other sections of the council, particularly into their finance service. We didn't require to do that here, and actually that would have prevented us from doing a lot of our standard work because we wouldn't have maintained that independence for that period of time. So we were in a very good position here that we managed to maintain our independence, but we did target our work to support the risks emerging at that time. And we spent a lot of our time over the last 2 years looking at the control environments, for example, around the Covert Grants, which we've been recognised as being sector leading in that area. So there was a flexibility nationally for me to qualify the annual opinion for 21-22 as there was for the previous year. We did not require that flexibility, so that's important, and that was something the external audit were certainly having an eye to. And if we had had to qualify our annual opinion, that would have resulted in additional external audit work for the Council. So I'm happy to say that we did carry out sufficient work, which is demonstrated in this report. If I move on to the paragraph 9, and that just picks up on the work we did around the COVID grants. This council disbursed approximately £50 million of COVID grants over the last 2 years. That's a phenomenal additional burden to put on councils, and we did it quickly. We got it out to the businesses quickly, which was a key criteria, but we did it safely, which was the other criteria. We have very, very few items in that 50 million which required investigation, and at the moment we've got no known fraud or error within that 50 million. And we had a visit from the Scottish Government's head of counter fraud profession, a few months ago, and his opinion after walking through our controls with us was that the arrangements at East Ayrshire Council were impressive. So that's not just about what internal audit were doing, that's about what all the services were doing, and primarily our Economic Development Service and Joe's service in terms of keeping us secure in terms of payment. So that worked incredibly well for us as a council. And in fact, tomorrow I am attending our National Chief Auditors meeting, and the Scottish Government's Head of Counter Fraud Profession will be at that meeting to discuss the control environments in other councils on the back of what he's seen here. And I've been collating some evidence from other councils for him. So we are very clearly at the forefront of that in terms of the approach we took, which was very proactive, very timely. Some councils are only now looking at their Covert Grants control environment. It's a wee bit after the horses bolted, to be quite frank. So we were in there early doors, and as a council, we got absolute support in that, as we always do. Every service in the council has their doors open for us, and we're invited in on a regular basis. So that will maybe give you some feel for the culture in the council in terms of welcoming audit and scrutiny, which I think is of note. Paragraph 10 just notes the number of Audit Scotland COVID-19 fraud publications which are available on your councillor's notice board. One of the publications, the Emerging Fraud Risk due to COVID-19, the draft of that report was subject to review by myself. We've got a really good working relationship with officers at Audit Scotland. So we were given that report in draft to offer our opinions on that document. If I move on to paragraph 12, you've heard Carolyn Watt saying that we're a robust internal audit. External Audit in their last report noted some very useful positive references about our work, and they're available for members in the report that went to committee on the 4th of November 2021. And that, as you know, each year External Audit review the work of internal audit. So we've got the auditors auditing the auditors. So to give the public and yourselves, members, some assurance that you can rely on the work that we're doing. If I move on to paragraphs 13 onwards, that was just to give you some background in terms of how we report. So we don't just give you this summary annual report. Our individual detailed internal audit reports are also made available to elected members. We don't put them out in public. They sit on your councillor's notice board, and the summary of those reports is in this public report. So they have been available since 2008 in your councillor's notice board. So there's quite an extensive library there. So I would welcome any queries on any of those reports from members going forward. The outcomes of our work for 2021 are presented in appendices 1 to 3. Appendix 1 is quite a detailed appendix. It's a workday appendix, and that follows on from a regulatory requirement for us to share. It's issues of significance, it says in the regulation. In my opinion, we've had no issues of significance in 21-22, because for me, an issue of significance would be something that impacts on the annual opinion. But what we do have are highlights and really important messages of assurance for members. So that's what we've laid out in Appendix 1. And Appendix 2 and 3 give you the outcomes of our work in a tabular format, which hopefully is easy to digest. So I've also laid out at paragraph 14 the opinions that we give for those individual audit assignments. So our highest opinion is sound assurance, and our lowest opinion would be no assurance. There's never been an exercise in this council which has resulted in no assurance. There's been the odd exercise over the years that's resulted in limited assurance, and that's fine, that happens, and it means we're looking at areas where perhaps there is more risk, and that's what we should be doing. Traditionally, most jobs have fallen into reasonable assurance, but interestingly, over the last 2 years, more and more of the assignments that we've done have fallen into either sound assurance in most areas or sound assurance, which has been an interesting shift over 2 very difficult and challenging years for the council. And that sits alongside the fact that services have continued to implement internal audit recommendations. Our services currently, for the last 3 years, have implemented internal audit recommendations at a rate of 100%. Now, we go out and test that implementation, but it's not really trying to catch people out. We work with services to make sure that the recommendations are implemented in the way that we all anticipated that they would be. So we've got a very, very high rate, the highest rate, 100% of implementation of internal audit recommendations. And that's important. And that's about the sustainability of that improvement to the control environment. If I can just touch on paragraph 16. Part of our regulatory requirements involves us carrying out not only self-assessments of internal audit, and that's in line with statutory and regulatory checklists that are supplied for that purpose. I think at the last count, we had 365 items that we had to check ourselves against. So it's a fairly robust approach. But not only do we do our annual self-assessments, every 5 years, and we're now in the second of those 5 years, every 5 years we have to get an external independent body to come in and look at the work we do in internal audit and compare that to our regulatory requirements. And in this council, we do that through competitive tender, and we're proposing to go out soon for that to identify the resource to carry out that external quality assessment. And the results of those quality assessments are presented in Appendix 5 with our responses to the continuous improvement aspects that have been picked up for the service. So I'll highlight other paragraphs in the report, a few other paragraphs, and then happy to take questions. So paragraphs 17 and 18 give you some insight into the lessons learned in our experience in internal audit of the COVID experience. And really that was an endorsement of our established practice. We aim to be agile, we do a lot of advisory work, we look to give rapid assurance, and we look to assimilate ourselves within services, independent but working with services. And for me, that's a very important part of what we do. Paragraphs 19 to 23, lay out the work we do around following the public pound. As members will be aware, the council is required to track funds across organisational boundaries. So the money that we give out, for example, to the Leisure Trust, or funds that we put into the Integration Joint Board, require to be tracked. And that's done through a number of mechanisms, not least of all the good financial controls that are in place. But we are also the external auditors of, internal auditors. Yes, no, I wouldn't want to be the external auditor. We are the internal auditors for all of these different service delivery models. And that's not necessarily the model that exists in other councils. Some councils have outsourced the internal audit of their IGBs, for example, or for their leisure trusts. In this council, the decision was made to keep all of the internal audit support for those different service delivery models within the council's in-house service. And for me, that's important because it means we're joined up, but as joined up as we possibly can be, but still maintaining, an independence in terms of the work that we do for each of those entities. Paragraph 24 gives you a summary of our plan achievement in 21-22. We did have some long-term sick absence during the year, which was unusual for our team, but we worked around it and we've still achieved a very high level of plan achievement, which again has helped me to have sufficient work to inform the annual opinion. And just other items to highlight in paragraphs 33 to 35, which support the annual opinion, which is laid out in Appendix 6. So all of our work for the council that's laid out in Appendixes 1 to 3 leads to this annual opinion. And that provides assurance with regards to the control environment within which the council spends its money. So that's how we kind of fit into that bigger picture. And I'll just touch on some of the highlights in Appendix 1. So job number 4 on page 60 lays out some more information on the work we did around the Covert Grants. And that included us leading a pan-Ayrshire data matching exercise. And Paul Davis is with us today, my audit manager, who's sitting at the back of the room. Paul is a whiz with data analytics. Paul's trained on IDEA software, which is a fantastic data analytics package. So we led on data matching for the whole of Ayrshire. We got all the payment files from North Ayrshire, South Ayrshire and from our own council, and we matched data, and we matched email addresses, we matched names, we matched addresses, we matched bank accounts, and came out with a list of matches and investigated to make sure there was no duplicate payments had been made across the 3 Ayrshires. We're the only region in Scotland that did that. And most other areas were waiting for the National Fraud Initiative, which is run by the Cabinet Office. And they took those COVID data sets as well from across the UK. And I'll tell you what the outcomes were, and you can make your own conclusions from that. The NFI gave us 5 matches for our data, none of which were fraud or error. There was an explanation for those matches. Quite often the bank accounts matched because a lot of particularly smaller companies were using the same agent, and that agent had all of the grants paid into their bank account and then dispersed it out to their clients. So the NFI exercise gave us 5 matches. And remember, £50 million worth of spend here, 5 matches. Our exercise, which we're actually just repeating again to catch up all the sort of smaller funds that have been dispersed over the last few months, gave us, I think, Paul, 2,000 matches. I'm looking for the nod at the back of the room, 2,000 matches, which were investigated, and there was only one item, which was fraud or error. You could argue it was either or, but that money was recovered within days by our finance colleagues. So that is an incredibly high level of assurance that we could take from that exercise. I don't think you could have taken the same level of assurance from the NFI exercise. And in fact, Audit Scotland then consulted us on a 3rd run of the NFI exercise, and we advised them not to do it because it was still flawed, and it hasn't happened, and I don't think it's going to happen. So the fact that we did all of that work locally and for North Ayrshire and South Ayrshire as well has given the Ayrshires much more assurance than any other area in Scotland has in that area. And that's a good result for us, but isn't probably different from the approach we would take in any other significant area of spend within the council. We aim to be proactive. We work with colleagues. Joe and I worked very closely together. In fact, I think at one point, Joe, we were having meetings throughout the night sometimes to put the arrangements in place, and it was very fast moving. But you know, the priority for us was to get the money out safely to local businesses, and that was the absolute priority for the council. I'm just going to mention a few other areas. I'm conscious of the time. Paragraph 5, we keep a small contingency. It's 20 days each year for small advisory work, and that's where services come to us for advice. Last year we dealt with 73 referrals. That's great. That's fantastic. People like to come to us. People work with us. People don't see audit as being, you know, the scary service. We're there to work with people, because at the end of the day, we all work for the same people. We all work for the community, and that's really, really important to me. So our doors are always open. You know, we make ourselves available. Paragraph 6 refers to the contingency we keep for fact-finding and investigations. And that's interesting in terms of the amount of days that we've spent on that, which is significantly less. There's very few days that we've spent over the last couple of years doing fact-finding and investigations. It's significantly less than we would have spent pre-COVID. And it's interesting because that's the pattern nationally. And we're delving into that in our National Chief Auditors group at the moment. I think there's a particular reason for it, and I think the reason, one of the main reasons is councils very quickly accelerated their transformation around digital processing, and had less paper processing, and that reduces the risk for fraud and error. And I suspect that that's part of it. It's not the full story, and we'll see what emerges as we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic. Fingers crossed. Corporate anti-fraud, paragraph 7 mentions the corporate fraud team with North Ayrshire, and you'll get to learn about them in due course. I'm planning to bring the corporate fraud team to our meeting in November, and I was speaking to the chair about this the other day, and we thought the corporate fraud team giving a presentation in November to support their mid-year report would be really useful for members. Council's got a high-profile presence on their web page in terms of stamping out fraud, and there is information on the website about the role of the corporate fraud team. But if you want any more information in the meantime, I'm more than happy to provide that. So that's a partnership that we're in with North Ayrshire Council, which I think is the only anti-fraud partnership in Scotland at the moment. And again, the Scottish Government are very interested in that, and our colleague at Scottish Government, who I mentioned earlier, the head of counter-fraud profession, is going to come and visit us this year to look at what we're doing around the anti-fraud work in the shared service with North Ayrshire. So you'll see from the other, I'm not going to go into any of the other paragraphs apart from paragraph 16, but you'll see the nature of the work we do and the spread of the work, Ayrshire Growth Deal, work around large transactional systems, work around payroll assurance. Our payroll system processes items to the value of 200 million a year, huge transactional system. It's important we do work on that on a regular basis. Job 16 was work that we did in heritage assets following a recommendation made by Deloitte in the report to committee in September last year, and that report has now been finalised. We've looked at the new procedures for the management of the collection, which are going up to full council on the 29th of June, and we've also sample tested a huge amount of the items to make sure that they're recorded in the new software system. Because the collection, we have a very large collection in East Ayrshire. I think, Joe, I'm right in saying it's one of the largest collections out with city councils, and a value in excess of 40 million currently on the balance sheet. So it's an important area for us as a council to get assurance on. And we had already been working with the Leisure Trust prior to external audit making their recommendation, and working on continuous improvement of controls in that area. So you can see other areas. Paragraph 17 notes cyber security, and I spoke about that work at the induction session. So, Chair, I wasn't going to go through any of the detailed appendices. Hopefully they've been cleared for members to digest, but I'm more than happy as always to take any questions now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ailey. This was a really good report, and I enjoyed chatting over with you the other day on it. I don't have any questions. I think I questioned you the other day there, but just to make a couple of comments, and particularly the COVID-19 insurance and anti-fraud work, and the really good endorsement of impressive from the Scottish Government Head of Counter-Fraud Profession. That is a fantastic endorsement to get here in East Ayrshire, and that just goes to show the work of your team and the commitment, and and just getting things done and making sure that it's done right and keeping East Ayrshire in safe hands, and that's been fantastic. We're looking forward to the presentation in November by the corporate anti-fraud team. That would be a really good presentation. I'm sure looking forward to that. And there was something, and throughout the report, it just demonstrates that you're working with all services. I mean, the Ayrshire Growth Deal, that's arguably the biggest thing in our books just now, making sure we get that sorted. Payroll assurance, housing, I mean, you're everywhere, and just your healthy culture, or there is a healthy culture within the council for internal audit, and that's reassuring for myself and for this committee. So that is to be acknowledged, and just the whole ethos of working with people, to give them that whole thinking that audit is good and it's not the scary service as you mentioned. So yeah, but that's been a great report. I'll hand over to any members if they've got any comments or questions. Councillor Adams.
Yeah, apologies for my lateness first. In page 63.16, job 33, it highlights existing disposal policy, particularly for low value multiple similar items. What sort of items are we talking about there, and what would be the low cost of things we're kind of, if you like, disposing of? Just some background there, please.
Through you, Chair. Councillor, good question. The phraseology actually was phraseology lifted from the external audit report last year, and they used that phraseology. And what it refers to is there are 130,000 items held in our collections, and they range from incredible pieces of fine art to these low value multiple similar items. So an example or some examples of those low value items, and they're actually valued at zero because they have no financial value, but they have maybe a cultural significance or social history significance. So, you know, they have a value, but not necessarily a financial value. And that's what I'm referring to here in terms of low financial value, or in fact zero financial value. So some of those items that are held in great quantities are shells, wee beasties, and I'm not very good in the Latin names for the wee beasties, but wee insects that are pinned in a big board. So we've got loads of the wee beasties, butterflies, things like that. So these have been held for a while. Magazines, quite a lot of women's weeklies and things like that, because there has been a policy over the years of not turning down any donations from the public. So, and sometimes there are nuggets in there, and sometimes it's the Women's Weekly. So there's a focus at the moment, and that's not to just detract from the collection. The collection's fabulous, and it's got some fabulous items in there, but there are boxes and boxes that are taking up storage space of items that have no financial value, and whether all of them have a social history value, that's been looked at the moment. So there's perhaps a more robust approach going to be taken going forward in terms of disposals. So does that answer your question, Councillor?
No, it does actually, and it begs a further question: that is it actually costing us money? You make reference to storage there, so is it costing us money to keep these low value items, and is there a better way of sharing them with the public, i.e. offering them to people, you know, social history groups, for example? But no, you've been very clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to pick up on that, sorry, Councillor, they are very small items, as I've probably indicated, so they are taking up, inevitably there'll be a small cost, but they are taking up very little space. And one of the recommendations we've got in our draft report, which we're currently clearing with the Chief Officer of the Leisure Trust prior to clearance with our client on that job, who is Joe, our Chief Financial Officer, is to look at what is it we should be doing with that collection going forward. What's the best value approach going forward, and not even for those, not just those low value items, but the higher value items, because some of the higher value items stay in storage for a lot of the year and they're not available to the public. And there's reasons for that, and it's just an area that maybe needs a wee bit of a refresh going forward, and just looking at how the community can share in the joy of that collection, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Hayley. Councillor Richardson, you want to come in?
Yeah, no, that was interesting. It was interesting to hear about the wee beasties and the butterflies, because I used to find those really interesting. I think for years and years and years, a lot of the butterflies and wee beasties were on display, especially up the stairs in the Dick Institute. And as a youngster, they were some of the more interesting cabinets for me. So I would just like to point out that maybe don't get rid of all of the butterflies and the wee beasties if possible, because certainly in years gone by they were pretty interesting for kids to view at the Dick Institute. That's all I wanted to say in that one.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Hogg, you want to come in? You have a question?
No, I don't have my hand up.
Councillor Maben.
Thanks, Larlene. The 50 million in COVID grant money to local business, can you give me a wee bit more detail on what that money is? Is this helping small businesses just to survive, or is that possibly furlough money to their employees, or is furlough money dealt with a totally different way? Thank you.
Through you, Chair, furlough money is dealt through nationally through, I think I'm right in saying, Joe, HMRC. And the money that we disbursed were grants for local, primarily grants for local businesses, so that they could survive through the pandemic. There was also other smaller grants in there that we brought within our control framework. So we had grants for the people self-isolating. We had low-income pandemic payments. We had payments within business grants. There was a myriad of schemes. In fact, I lost count of how many schemes we had to manage, each with different criteria around them. And that's one of the things that we're currently feeding back to Scottish Government through the National Chief Auditors group, is that in hindsight, it's always a great thing that these schemes, the local schemes, could have been, I think, some more consistency between the eligibility criteria. But having said that, that's the game we're in, and we're used to reading terms and conditions and getting on with it. So the bulk, Councillor Maven, the bulk of the money that went out was going to small businesses, and those initially it was sort of lump sum payments, and then that became a regular payment which went out on a monthly basis over a period of time to local businesses that met certain criteria. And most of those grants were related to NDR records. So you had to evidence that you were registered for non-domestic rates with this council to be eligible for the grant. So we already had a very good inbuilt control environment there, because Joe's team, our revenue and benefits team, know their community out there. They know their NDR records well, they know the cases well. So we had a very strong foundation to start from in terms of knowing who was a legitimate business out there and who wasn't. And there was quite a lot of applications were declined because they came from people trying to get money who weren't entitled to it. And they were picked up. We also audited a large number of the applications that were declined, and they were declined appropriately. So I'm satisfied that the money went out to the correct people in the community. And the other check that was done within the council was to ensure that there was no gaps, that everybody in the community was well aware that this money was available and applied for it. And Joni's team worked with our communications team to promote the grants very widely in the community. And Joe's team also put in place, in my view, a very robust but easy to use application form. I think the Scottish Government, if I recall correctly, Joe, sent out a paper application for a word-based application form, and Joe's team translated that into an online application form that did a lot of the work for you. And I thought that was a great way of going about giving the grants out. So that's maybe a wee bit more than you asked for. Sorry, I've got a propensity to talk too much sometimes, but you'll get used to that.
Do you want to come back in then, Peter?
Just, well, the 50 million, I take it was that 50 million from government money that then we were tasked to hand out, and it wasn't affecting council budget, it wasn't council money as well?
That's correct, yes.
Councillor Canny.
Yeah. First of all, just wanted to echo everything that Elaine had said earlier. Thanks for an excellent report. Just on, you mentioned the external quality assessment, and obviously it was out to tender. Could you maybe expand a little bit on the process that's followed to select that vendor?
Thank you, Councillor. The external quality assessment, which is required in line with our statutory and regulatory obligations, and it's particularly required through the regulatory document, the Public Sector Internal Audit Standards, which are published by the standard setters for internal audit in the UK. And I'm trying to remember them all off the top of my head, but I'll probably miss somebody. But the standard setters are UK government, and then with a contribution by Scottish government, by Welsh government, by the Finance Department in Northern Ireland, by HMRC, by the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, CIPFA, which is the accountancy body that I'm a member of and Joe and Julie are members of. And they nationally publish the regulations that we have to meet. And I mentioned earlier, there's, I think, 365 aspects the last time we counted them that we need to meet in terms of regulation. And part of one of those elements is to do every 5 years an external quality assessment. So other than saying it's external and has to be independent of your organisation, there's no other prescription around that. We go out to tender on it. We go with a quick quote. It's not an expensive process. We're talking in the very, very low thousands of pounds, very low thousands of pounds. And the last time, actually, interestingly, it was Glasgow City Council who won the contract because they operate a commercial arm of their internal audit. And they won the contract the last time. So that was quite nice, you know, that we kept the money within the public sector. That may happen again. We're going to quick quote, it's open to tender. And some councils do a peer review with other councils. Some of my colleagues are not given any budget to carry out these exercises. And there's a bit of a peer review exercise has developed within Scotland. So one council will look at another council. We decided not to do that because, quite frankly, you don't get to choose who then does your EQA, and we want some control over the quality aspect of that job. So I think what we're doing is best practice, and it's once every 5 years. And it is useful because it's always useful to have another pair of eyes. The last time there was no showstoppers came out, but just some useful observations. So we're always absolutely open to continuous improvement in internal audit as well. So hopefully that answers your question, Councillor.
Yeah, largely, I was maybe the process internally within the council for selection, but we can pick that up later. It's not.
I'm happy to just very quickly mention that.
Sorry, and also maybe having a really good audit function, is that something we could revenue stream similar to Glasgow City Council in terms of doing the EQs for other councils?
It's one we've looked at, and it's always up there on my list of options on the wall. It's always there, but Glasgow have experienced some issues, particularly recently. They've lost a number of staff. They've had difficulty recruiting, and it can be a challenge to deliver your contractual obligations for other entities, and at the same time deliver a good service within your own council. And that I wouldn't like to put our internal audit service in this council under that pressure, because, well, as you know, we currently have vacancies as well, and internal audit is a very difficult area to recruit for nationally. I'm hopeful that we'll get some luck and joy in our current recruitment exercise, but you've got to balance up all the risk in terms of that. So, and just to quickly answer your question about the methodology, it's a quick quote mechanism we're going to use, which is a national mechanism, and we'll and that's for any supplies or services up to £50,000. We will choose, you're given there's a national list of all the bodies that are on the quick quote system, and you can choose usually 5 to provide quotes. So I would usually go with any public sector organisations that are there offering services, and our current contractor as well, who has provided a good service over the last few years at a very reasonable price. Yeah, that's. I hope that answers. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, Councillor Richardson, you come in.
Hello there. This is maybe a question for Joe, possibly. One of the things that Deloitte's pointed out, I think, I think I saw it in maybe page 31. And understandably, a lot of families have had, a lot of issues. Some of them, a lot of them financial during the 2 years of COVID. But I just noted that the council's rent arrears are currently about 9.5% compared to a target of 5%. And the question was, as we come out of COVID and we hopefully recover and family finances hopefully are getting back on their feet, does the council have a plan to work sympathetically with families in order to bring that percentage down closer to the 5%?
Through you, Chair. Yeah, absolutely, Councillor Richardson. But we do so with a number of thoughts in our minds. So at the height of the pandemic, the council took the really helpful decision to suspend follow-up on both rent and council tax, essentially providing tenants and individuals and families across East Ayrshire with a holiday where we stopped all follow-up action and essentially stopped the clock. That was to recognise the job losses that were taking place and the real issues around the immediate imposition of the COVID restrictions and what that did to families and to people with work. It was probably one of the best things we did. It was needed, because what we found through those business grants that Ailey spoke about was that we found that there were individuals and families, individuals in particular, who had worked in a particular industry all their life, but unlucky for them and very, very unlucky for them, they just happened to be in the wrong industry at the wrong time. And so it's people who had worked all their days who found themselves unemployed and then had to enter into the DWP system. And so that holiday produced a great deal of help and relief to families and individuals. It did, as a result, stockpile and lead to arrears both in council tax and in rents. Now, in following that up, and we're doing that, both Blair Miller, the Head of Housing and Communities, and I are following up those two separate elements to bring income back in, because you'll hear from the East Ayrshire Reforms Report that income, both services making savings and trying to spend less, but also trying to bring in as much money as we can is important. It must be done sympathetically, and I think that holiday suggests and highlighted just the type of actions that we take. In terms of rent, we've got another issue to consider there, in that the housing service within a council will always be the housing provider of last resort. So if someone has arrears and we choose to evict, or a private landlord evicts or a registered social landlord evicts, then that family, that individual, will immediately come to the council, who will then have to house. So there's a very delicate operation to take place particularly in housing rents, to get those arrears down, but to do so in a way that is mindful to our duties. Blair Miller has us in hand. We have a really unusual model where we have housing coaches out in all areas that work alongside families and individuals and tenants, and also individuals in private homes, to try and maximise the income that they have and to try and work through repayment plans. So that's what we do in the first instance, particularly with housing rents. Council tax is a little bit different, but I can come on to that later.
Thanks for that answer, Joe. That's a really full answer and answers my point. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions, members? Councillor Maben.
Just on the same subject, is there not a danger that this situation could actually get worse instead of better, as we hit a cost of living crisis and fuel going up, heating going up, inflation going up?
I think it probably could, Peter, but I'll hand over to Joe to let you know what his forward thinking is.
So through you, Chair, it's not just my forward thinking. We had the cross-party sounding board where the group leaders and deputy leaders attended and had a briefing on a whole number of areas. And one of the things that's close to their heart and ours as officers is around cost of living. You'll hear in the report that I'll present later that we have an allocation. We've got a fund put by to help with cost of living. But the scale of the problem is going to be a real challenge going forward. The scale of the problem for the council in trying to manoeuvre its way through it will be challenging enough. The pressures placed on specific households will be many times worse, and so we have an allocation that we can use, and we are looking at other means at the request of the cross-party sounding board. But we're in one of these terrible situations where the scale of the problem is so big that we hear from both governments in UK and Scottish to say that they can provide some relief, but the scale of it is such that it's actually bigger than the resources they have to fix. And we're looking at what modelling shows in terms of alleviation of those pressures that will take place. But I'm also very conscious that in an hour and a half's time, the Bank of England will announce the latest round of interest rates, and it's likely to show a further increase.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Does that answer your question, Peter? Yeah, so looking grim as we move forward, isn't it? Grim. And we have to be mindful of that. But that will show through in the East Ayrshire performance, and we just have to be mindful of the information that's presented to us in our decisions in future meetings, etc. Okay, anybody else? No. So the recommendations are on page 50, paragraph 2. Can we agree? Yep. Okay, thank you. So item 5, Ailey, it's yourself again, the internal audit plan for 22-23. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The good news is that we spent quite a lot of time going over the background to internal audit in the previous report, so we can get through this one fairly swiftly. The public sector internal audit standards set out a number of obligations, as we've mentioned this morning, and 2 of those obligations are for committee to approve the annual internal audit plan, which is what this paper is today. So the plan's laid out in appendices 1 to 4. And at paragraph 18, it also requires the council to give me a delegated authority to make changes to that plan. And that means the plan is always a live plan. So the plan that you agree today can then be subject to changes. And what we do as part of our established approach is I would bring up a plan with any revisions in mid-year. And that can quite often be for information as well as approval, because we move quickly to change the plan if there are any emerging risks that arise between now and the mid-year report in November. Now, just to give you some assurance around that, we tend not to make many changes to the plan because the plan's drawn up with a lot of consultation around the council with the key officers, and it's usually served us well during the year, and it's identified the areas of risk that are the right areas to be looking at this year. But from time to time other items come up, and one of the areas that can really impact on the plan, and it's reflected in the risks outlined in this report, is where we might have a large fact-finding or investigation to carry out. Now, that doesn't happen very often in this council, but it happens, and we tend to get involved in those exercises. So that can have a significant impact on the plan. And if that happens, that would be discussed in the first instance with the chair, and then we would identify whether we would need to come back up to committee earlier than November. We've never had to do that up until now, so hopefully that'll be the case this year. I've probably put the jinx in it now by mentioning it, but never mind. So it's just to make sure that committee is aware that the plan's the plan today, but may have to change depending on emerging risks. So I think everybody will appreciate that principle. So that's us covered paragraph 18. Paragraphs 33 to 42 lay out the resourcing. So obviously, in order to deliver the plan, I need to have a level of resources. Those resources are currently getting reviewed with the support of the Chief Executive and Joe. And we're actually out for recruitment at the moment for a senior auditor. And I'm confident that although other councils have had problems, I'm confident we'll get some new people in through that process. So at the moment, and as laid out in paragraph 40, we're presenting a plan with 800 days for the council. I anticipate by the time I come back in November that hopefully will have increased to a number closer to 1,000. days. So that would be more in line with what we've had in prior years. And bear in mind, over the years, we've taken on more and more obligations year on year. So Leisure Trust, IGIB, the Ayrshire Roads Alliance and the Ayrshire Growth Deal, which all have their own particular reporting obligations. So that I'm hoping that the number of days are in that table for 22-23 increase, and we're certainly doing everything we can to make sure that that's the case. Paragraphs 45 to 53 give you a summary of how the plan is prepared, and although paragraph 46 notes, and I love this phrase, there's no substitute in local government for doing the boring really well. We do the boring really well, really well. We do the innovative well, we do the creative well, but we do that boring well. And that actually is a quote from the best value inspection of what was Northamptonshire Council. And you may be aware Northamptonshire Council doesn't exist anymore. It was closed down a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, and that was one of the areas was their stable foundations had lost their stability. So their core systems and other aspects of that council had, for various reasons, a lot of challenges, and I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but it is important that our audit plan reflects our stable foundations in this council, and they're subject to continuous improvement on through our work. So the plan for this year includes quite a lot of work within payroll, not because we think there's a lot of risk in payroll, because of any concerns we've got, but it's 200 million a year, so you would look at it, wouldn't you? So we've got 3 big jobs in there, including a job to look at the new monthly pay run. As you may be aware, the council moved to a monthly pay run from April this year. So people have moved from a 4-weekly pay run, from weekly pay runs to a new monthly pay run. So we're just going to be looking at the control aspects around that, and particularly around what they call the bounce payments, which is effectively a loan that's made to a number of staff to help them through that transition. So we just need to make sure that that's all in order and the council's going to recover its money there. So the plan includes those types of stable foundation items, but also a lot of advisory items in terms of future foundations. The reserve list Appendix 4 is items that we haven't been able to accommodate into the plan. Remember, the plan's risk-based, so we need to make sure that the plan is those higher risk items and items we think are probably useful to look at some point, and that their risk may elevate in time, are included in the Appendix 4. So we've always got that up our sleeve. So some of what's in Appendix 4 will make its way into the plan following any successful recruitment that we have during the year. And the only other paragraph I wanted to mention, Chair, is paragraph 62, that I made a brief mention of this earlier, but the plan includes Appendix 2, Job 19. There are 33 days set aside for fact-finding and investigations. And in some years that's been, a figure over 100 days. But the trend has been that we're not getting involved in as many fact-finding and investigations because they just don't seem to be appearing as much over the last couple of years. But that can change, that can very easily change. And quite often we spend time doing fact-finding, and actually, it can come through allegations, anonymous allegations, and quite often, we'll carry out fact-finding and actually find very little. There's not much to look at, there's not much to find. There might be some continuous improvement recommendations, but the allegation in itself might not be founded, but we will look into all significant allegations that are received. So it's just to again put the marker down that the plan as it sits today may have to be changed if that type of new risk appears. And we'll keep you updated on that. So today, so the plan is laid out, as I said, in Appendices 1 to 4. Appendix 2 goes into the detailed, that's effectively the detailed work plan that my team work to. in terms of individual jobs and days allocation. So each member of my team has an individual work plan that sits below this, which has a higher level of detail, and the content of each job is agreed with the service. So we enter into a contract, an audit brief with every service to agree the job that we'll carry out. So we set out the objectives of what we're doing, the risks around that area, and the methodology that we will carry out, and we indicate a date by which we anticipate completion and the number of days that we'll spend in that job. So we enter into those agreements for all of the planned jobs that we have listed at Appendix 2. So I'll just give you a bit more insight into how we deliver the plan. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the reports that we conclude at the end of our exercise are posted onto the members, and I wanted to say members portal, but I think we officially call it the Councillors Notice Board, don't we? I better use its Sunday name. The Councillors Notice Board, we post it onto the Notice Board, so you get the full assignment report in due course. So, Chair, I think that was everything I wanted to say about the plan. Hopefully the paper's clear, and obviously happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ailey. All I would say is just keep doing the boring really well. So, I mean, does anybody have any comments or questions for Ailey? No, nobody online. Okay, so the recommendations are on page 86 at paragraph 2. Can we agree those? Yep. Okay, thanks very much, Ailey. Thank you. So going to item 6, and it's a progress report on the East Ayrshire Violence Against Women Partnership 2021-22, and that's Dale Mellor. Hi, Dale.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, colleagues. My name is Dale Mellor. I'm a Senior Manager in the Health and Social Care Partnership, and I support the East Ayrshire Violence Against Women's Partnership. So the report that you've got in front of you comes every year. It's essentially an activity and progress report, and what I'm going to do is pick out a few highlights, but obviously if members want to talk about anything, that's absolutely grand. Firstly, just to explain, particularly for new members, what the partnership is all about. The council is fully involved in the partnership, but essentially it's a partnership of multiple agencies, all of whom are committed to or provide services for people affected by domestic abuse and their children. We have a really vibrant and well-involved partnership in East Ayrshire, and hopefully the activity report reflects some of that. We've got some very committed partners. We have a strategic plan, the partnership for 2021 to 24, so we're kind of midway through that, and that's available online. There's a link in the report for you if you want to see that, and obviously can provide much more detail on that if you want. But essentially our strategic plan aligns itself to Scottish policy around domestic abuse, which is the Equally Safe policy plan. Equally Safe has been around for a good while now, and we're very familiar with it in East Ayrshire, but essentially it lays out there under point 7 what the aspirations and aims of Equally Safe are, and our partnership plan aligns itself to that. So this year in the partnership, we've done a bit of work at paragraph 10 in the report. We have been monitoring and tracking our progress towards our strategic plan. I lead a monitoring group that looks after all of the actions there, and there is a detailed report, a monitoring report available if members want it, that shows how we're getting on in terms of progress towards the outcomes there. A lot of detail, and some of the information in the report really reflects that very well. So just to point that out, that there's information sitting behind this report if members want it. So I'm going to point out the obvious, hopefully, to people under paragraph 16. The impact of the pandemic on victims of domestic abuse has been pretty profound. It's a no-brainer for me that lockdown created additional tension for already stressed situations for individuals and families. And as a result of that, we enhanced our work during the pandemic. We called it oversight. We set up oversight groups around vulnerabilities, and one of which was violence against women and girls. And we've got a snapshot there of the domestic abuse rates captured, only the domestic abuse rates captured by police data. Obviously, that's one source of data, but there are many. So although this reflects 21 to 22, the oversight work started in May, immediately after the pandemic in 2020, and has continued through the last financial year. Under paragraph 20, you can see that in December 21, when Omicron variant started to play out, we enhanced our oversight work again. So essentially, I pulled together an oversight group, which was the key partners who deliver support around domestic abuse. And it was a way of sharing information, escalating risks and mitigating those. That group has now been suspended again, but it can, of course, be put back into place if we need to as a response to any increase in pandemic need. So I wanted also to highlight under paragraph 29, we have been implementing a programme called Safe and Together. And this is really a framework for practice around vulnerability and domestic abuse. And it's a model that helps practitioners, whether it's social work, health, police, voluntary sector. It's a model that supports abusing and non-abusing parents in a family context. It kind of switches the focus from the non-abusing parent being lacking in their parental care to seeing abuse as a parental choice. It's quite a controversial view, but the model is really clear that it's there to support families in a different way and switch that filter of potentially double blaming the victim of domestic abuse. So we've been rolling out training and learning opportunities across the multi-agency workforce, and actually COVID didn't interrupt that too much. We just delayed the start of that. So that's something that's ongoing. We have successfully trained our children and families workforce, and we're now moving on to adult services as well to roll out that model. Wanted also to highlight to members, because you may well want to get involved this year, that under paragraph 33, there's a brief description of activities undertaken during the 16 days of action to eradicate violence against women. That runs annually from the end of November into the start of December. And our elected members have previously got really involved in a series of activities there, some of them public, some of them conference style activities to support knowledge and awareness sharing around violence against women. So we had an online conference again this year and a series of activities to support and raise awareness. So really welcome anyone getting involved this year, that would be great. There was one other thing, two other things, sorry, I wanted to highlight in the report. Under paragraph 51, there is a new initiative that's now rolled out across all of our secondary schools, and the next plan is to roll it into our early year centres, called Trauma Informed Contact and Care. And that's an initiative where police report into education establishments the next morning information about any incidents of domestic abuse in a family setting that impacts on a child in that school. That's so that immediate support and care can be provided if necessary, but also really essential to let people know what's happening in a child's life. So the plan is to roll that out across early childcare centres as well this year, as you can see in the report. I wanted to highlight as well at paragraph 84, my colleague in housing, Helen Merriman, has led on a women's safety survey that reported in March this year. So we are still working through the findings of that survey. You've got the kind of key headlines in the report there. But this was really to help us understand more about the feelings of women, of safety of women and girls in and around East Ayrshire, whether out and about or in the domestic setting. And there's some areas identified in paragraph 89 that give us lots of work to take forward. So just to let members know that that work will come forward in the following year. The last thing I wanted to highlight is under paragraph 104. Is an initiative that the council has funded along with North Ayrshire, South Ayrshire Council, Police and the NHS Board. and that's the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference. This is a way of sharing information and safety planning for victims of domestic abuse who are at risk of significant harm or death. It's a methodology that's in place across all of Scotland apart from Ayrshire, so it's something we've kind of been a bit behind on. But last year, following scoping work, we had multi-agency agreement to fund the work. There's a coordination team being established, and I'm leading on supporting the development of the East Ayrshire MARAC. So we will have 3 MARACs, one for South, North and East, but all coordinated through central coordination. So that's going to go live from the 1st of August this year. So we're currently in doing mock MARACs and working out the finer details of how all that will work. It's a significant investment from the council and a significant way of protecting some of our most vulnerable victims. Finally, just to say that the council has been really supportive of this area of work. Sorry, it's just gone off in my room. Last year successfully approved the funding for a Violence Against Women lead officer, and that's a role that will sit in my wider public protection and learning team, hoping for the person to come into post over summer because we've undertaken recruitment. So hopefully next year we'll have another colleague to help support the partnership and to tell you a bit more about the work of the partnership. Chair, that was all I was going to highlight today, but really happy to take any questions from members. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dale. Well, this is a sobering report. Just shows you just the domestic violence is really, you know, it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It's here, and it's in some cases it's increasing. I read some of the case studies and the surveys in your appendices. I'm glad to see that, you know, it's like feedback from survivors and how to improve the service. I think that's really key moving forward, because I think to be able to improve in your service and deliver a service that's going to actually meet the needs of the recipient, then we have to listen to those who have experienced it and have lived through the abuse. I'm delighted about the initiative with the police in the schools. That's really us putting our arms around those young people and protecting them and letting them know that we're protecting them out with what they've witnessed and in some cases what they're experiencing. It's just horrendous. At the recent police and fire rescue meeting, one of the reports there stated there was 175 domestic abuse alarms out in the community, 175, and that included resources from the fire service, fire repellent doormats, etc., and coverings for letterboxes. I mean, it's horrendous. And it also read in the survey where people felt most unsafe, and they said bus stations. So I took that back to police colleagues as well. So hopefully in the future there'll be an opportunity where, you know, Stagecoach, police, violence against women can all get around the table and perhaps, you know, discuss the possibility of a safe space in bus stations rather than these people not wanting to be there, but creating a positive aspect of the bus stations, and that is, you know, to make it a safe space. And I recognise there are lots of safe spaces in Kilmarnock, and that would be a fantastic addition. I think certainly something that I will be moving forward to explore in the creation of a safe space in our bus stations. The street lighting, yeah, I think it's for elected members to take that forward and push for whatever that, you know, we can do to make these places feel safer for women. It's really important. Reclaim the Night Walk March, I was proud to be a part of that. It was a successful event, a very happy event. Lots of people really just blowing whistles, and it was raising awareness, and it was all down King Street and all through the town centre, and it really did raise awareness, and that was a really good event to be part of. A really good report. It's a sobering report, but it's good that we're actually got good services and people know that we're here for them, and that's important. I'll open up to members. Do you have any comments or questions? Okay, So, well, thanks, Dale. So, members, page 110, paragraph 2 is the recommendations. Can we agree those recommendations? Yep, yep, yep. Okay. Dale, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. And so, the next item, duty of candour, registered daycare of children's services and housing support services. And that's Janie Allen. Are you there, Jenny?
Yes, I'm here, Chair. My colleague Lisa Punton is actually going to take the report.
Oh, I beg your pardon, Lisa. I beg your pardon, Lisa. Are you?
Sorry, Chair, I'm here. Yes, thank you. I'm Lisa Punton, the Housing Services Manager, for those who don't know me. So the purpose of this report this morning is to remit to Governance and Scrutiny Committee annual reports on incidents which meet the duty of candour for housing support services and registered daycare of children services for the period the 1st of April 2021 to the 31st of March 22. Recommendations are set out at paragraph 2 of the report, and members will note appendices 1 and 2 contain the annual reports for both services and that there are no reportable incidents which meet the threshold for reporting under the duty of candour. Paragraphs 3 to 9 contain the background on the duty. Duty of Candour Procedure Scotland Regulations 2018 set out the procedure that organisations providing health services, care services and social work services in Scotland are required by law to follow when there has been an unintended or unexpected incident which results in death, a permanent lessening of bodily, sensory, motory, physiologic or intellectual functions, or harm not being severe harm. The duty places a duty on all registered health, social work and care services, with the exception of childminders, to be open and honest with patients or service users or their families when an incident of this nature occurs. However, the duty will only apply when the organisation is notified by a healthcare professional that in the professional's reasonable opinion such an incident has occurred. It does not apply where the incident was minor in nature or miss. However, it asks all registered services, which include daycare of children services and housing support, an annual return. The annual return has been updated to ask organisations if they have produced their annual report on the duty and if they've been notified of any incidents which trigger the duty. Even if there are no incidents to which the duty applies, a short annual report is still required as it must contain information about staff training on the duty. Paragraphs 10 to 13 discuss the annual report and sets out the primary purposes of the report and what must be covered to comply with the legislation, as well as the style of the report. The reports contained appendices 1 and 2 are reflective of the requirements. Implications are set out at paragraphs 14 to 22, and I would draw members' attentions to paragraphs 14 and 16, noting the legal and risk implications associated with the duty and failure to comply which could result in prosecution. Members, to conclude, this is a really positive report which demonstrates we are fulfilling our obligations in relation to the duty of candour, and equally as important, there are no incidents which meet the threshold for reporting under the duty. Thank you, Chair, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Lisa. Yes, it is a positive report. Really pleased that there have been no incidents. And also I'll be accessing the training on LearnPro. I think that would be very good to have under your belt. So, do any members have any questions, comments? No. No. Okay, members. So, as Lisa said, the recommendations are on page 138, paragraph 2. Can we agree those recommendations? Okay. Thank you very much, Lisa, for your report. Thank you. Thanks, Janie. And we move across to our next item, which is East Ayrshire Performs, and that's you, Joe.
Thank you, Chair. And members, this is the year-end East Ayrshire Performs report. It was a report that was presented and approved by Cabinet yesterday, and it's also a report that by its very nature comes to Governance and Scrutiny for review as well. The report is the story of the Council's finances and other performance indicators for the financial year 2021-22. Colleagues are on screen to help take us through relevant parts of this report. And the report begins essentially at paragraph 7. And I suppose in trying to explain this table, maybe the far right column is the one to look at, and where you see a bracket, then that means there's been an underspend. Now, essentially the story of last year is an interesting one in that we've got the council budget, the core budget is under incredible stress and strain, but it's also a year, as Ailey touched on, with those COVID grants, where not only did we get grants to support businesses, we got grants to support the council too, particularly for those areas that were feeling incredible pressure from COVID. And so we highlighted in the budget report that Council said in February that the year that's just ended would be a year when it would be likely when every service would underspend even though they were fighting COVID. That has turned out to be the case, and the table shows that across all services there has been underspend. But as you'll see from this report, that underspend has only been achieved by recognising the COVID assistance, those COVID grants that's been received by the council. So it was a break-even position last year financially after taking account of a number of items, and yesterday Cabinet agreed those items. But to start off with, I'll just explain that the Council's general fund uncommitted balance, that money that we have set aside, that was touched on by Carolyn in terms of our assessment of financial sustainability. It's the money that we put by that has no calls on it, and it's there because there's a requirement for a council to keep a sum of money somewhere between 2 and 4% of its net revenue expenditure. And the money we have is £9.2 million or 2.6% of our net revenue expenditure. So it's towards the lower end of that spectrum, that range. And it's my view that we need to endeavour to have that increased in the coming months. But yesterday Cabinet approved a series of sums to be set aside to support contractual obligations and waste. They gave approval to add £384,000 to a previous amount that we received for cost of living, taking that cost of living pot up to £1.5 million. And as I touched on, cross-party sounding board were quite clear, offers us to go away and to work up options to bring back to a future cross-party sounding board in order to provide solutions to some of the pressures that are hitting individuals and families this year. We are, of course, mindful that the cost of living rates are rising. We also sought approval and received it yesterday to set aside £880,000 for the council's own energy prices. Now, when we set the budget, we set the budget on the basis that we knew what the council's energy bill would be for this year, broadly speaking, because the energy is bought so far in advance. However, at that point, we were not aware of the extent of the October price cap, which forecasters are telling us is likely to be of the same magnitude as the April price cap, and sitting at 4%. Nor did we realise at the time of the budget that the energy industry had lobbied for an amended price cap, recognising that the 6-month space between price caps is causing issues for the industry. And so there's every likelihood that there'll be a January 2023 price cap review as well. And so Cabinet again yesterday gave approval to set aside some to help with our energy costs for the year we're in. During the year, we took the opportunity to transfer some out of reserves, out of renewal and repairs funds to give to other services, and Cabinet approved yesterday that £800,000 will be transferred back into deal with a whole host of issues that colleagues and services are dealing with. And as we do in every research performance, we show at paragraph 10 the savings options or the cuts that were approved as part of budget setting and which are monitored by colleagues in finance and ICT. And you'll see that there's 2 options there in facilities and property management, £95,000, and a material amount in compared to the council's total budget, but which will be which has not been met, in which the head of facilities and property management will take action to find alternative options for that in order to balance his budget. On paragraph 11, we begin to talk about the COVID grants for the year that we have, and they're broken down into 3 distinct areas, and it's explained in the paragraph what they are. And in the table at paragraph 12, we can see that there's £1.689 million for service-specific COVID grants. These are grants given to councils for a very specific purpose, and we can align that purpose to a service. So in that line, that 1.689 is made up of education recovery grants to recognise disruption caused by school closures, by Omicron and by remote learning, and also a further grant for remote learning to provide the necessary kit and devices for children, and that's been done. We also received grants that by their very nature we can't give to one service because they hit a whole number of services, and 3.374 is held for that. COVID logistics grant is in there, and the financial insecurity grant is in there too. And that's a grant that is, as colleagues and members mentioned earlier, that can be used to support those who have arrears of rent or arrears of council tax, and that's been taken forward by colleagues. At the end of the previous year, the Scottish Government awarded every council a COVID discretionary grant. Our grant was 14.293 as noted in the table. Cabinet kindly approved a recommendation in an earlier restage performance report to give £1.973 million to services. This was at the peak of the pandemic, where services were experiencing significant additional costs, and those income streams that were so important to budgets were no longer available. And then when we set the budget in February, we asked Council, following discussions with group leaders, to set aside £5.939 or £6 million to create 200 apprentices. And you can see in the Cabinet report yesterday that was just far more detail around the totality of that and the actions that the head of People and Culture has taken to bring on those young people and those graduate interns, which is incredible. As with every East Ayrshire performance report at year end, we talk about the reserve strategy of the council. And as a council with a £360 million budget, we take action through a reserve strategy that permits services to carry forward any underspends they have at the year end, and that becomes a credit or a gain into the next year's budget. Where a service overspends at year end, then that becomes the first hit on next year's budget. And that reserve strategy ensures that financial planning can take place within services, and that removes the risk of any quick spend taking place within this council. And Ailey is and I are on top of that. That does not take place, and the reserve strategy facilitates that forward thinking and forward planning. So essentially, members, at paragraph 12, what Cabinet were discussing yesterday was that £6.381 million, which is the remains of our COVID grants. It's a sum of money, a substantial sum of money that we have at our disposal. But just as COVID appears to have gone, we're learning to live with the virus, new pressures around cost of living have been replaced and been replaced with them. And it's bringing incredible pressures to the council and to individuals and families. And so, as I say, well, that £6.381 million sounds like a great deal of money. It will be required to support the council in the years ahead, and also in the families and the households across East Ayrshire. We show as well at paragraph 16 the balance of the general fund and that earmarking that's taken place. And we note at paragraph 19 the housing revenue account, which had a surplus of £2.3 million last year, and we'll explain more about that in the covering report. And then again, Cabinet was asked yesterday just to note at paragraph 20 that because of the real pressures being faced in terms of capital and building, that the head of housing and communities is putting just a marker down that they're looking at the full year impact of those additional pressures, those supply chain shortages, those workforce shortages, and what that means for the house building programme. And he'll update Cabinet in November with that outcome. And then Cabinet approved yesterday to declare the former schoolhouse at Cumnock Academy surplus. And just as we heard about the duty of candour report, in this report as well, in this time of year, we bring about a couple of paragraphs on the Regulation of Investigative Powers Act, which is a power that the council has in terms of surveillance and the like that can take place. We're obliged to note where that power has been used, and in this report we note that for the whole of last year it was not used at all. The following paragraphs, Chair, are covered more widely in the forthcoming report which I'll present, but I'm happy to stop there and take any questions.
Thanks, Joe. Does anybody have any comments or questions at this point for Joe? No. No. So just on the figures, Joe, I mean, it really is. It's going to be difficult the next couple of years. The next few years, in fact, are going to be really difficult for the council. Cost of living has been mentioned. Energy prices, fuel costs, food costs. It's going to be horrific for their people out in East Ayrshire as well as for councils across Scotland. So it's just it's a good report and just advising us as we move forward. So thanks for that. Moving forward on the revenue.
Thank you, Chair. So we begin at page 157, and what this covering report does is it expands out that further information. It splits the revenue budget into various services, and it starts off with the services that sit under the Chief Executive. And you can see within education, that education service has ended the year with a 3.531 underspend. Now, the majority of that has been due to Covert Grants. It's due to the timing of spend on Pupil Equity Fund, another section in this report, where as the year end approaches, we need to capture the financial position of Pupil Equity Fund at 31st of March. But of course, members, you know that continues on until the end of the academic year in June. And so that underspend noted there. What I would say is that there's a continued pressure in terms of ASN transport costs, underspending by about £700,000 last year. It's something that has overspent in previous years. Colleagues are looking at it to try and find solutions, but there's additional pressures in the entire ASN network. In this report, in this page, what we then see is a couple of boxes near the middle of the page that attempts to explode out further that underspend and why it's occurred and what the services are doing around it. So the 1.56 on Pupil Equity, I'll explain that shortly. And you can see in there the 1.451, that's for young person's guarantee, young people's guarantee. You'll have heard that in other meetings. That's money that has been held because young people have been paid, they've got contracts and they've been paid, but that doesn't stop at 31st of March. That payments will take forward into the year, and so that money carries forward. We also take the opportunity this year this time of year to note the school carry forwards, and for those of you who are on parent councils, then this will be important to you because you then see the carry forwards that each head teacher and their management team are taking to take forward into the new term that will start in August. And then Finance and ICT, my service ended the year £1 million underspent, and you'll see that that's mostly due to staffing vacancies. I'm carrying a great many vacancies. My service redesign will be presented to Cabinet after recess, where those vacancies will be utilised in other ways. It shows here the year end how that underspend will be used, and we can see that £307,000 of that underspend is due to the Scottish Welfare Fund budget. This is a fund that's provided by Scottish Government that provides crisis grants and community care grants for families and for individuals, and that £307,000 will be added on to this year's £1 million to take that forward and continue spending in the year ahead. And the £215,000 provisions is due to an agreement and approval from an earlier Cabinet report, and I've set aside funds for that. In terms of governance, again, an underspend taking place here. You can see the table that expands the reasoning for that and the carry forwards that are taking place. This underspend taken similar to myself and David is salary costs, and also as we're beginning to see the good signs of around a fee income for building warrants and planning income. Page 159 sets out the services that sit under the Deputy Chief Executive in Community and Economy. And you can see here that the right-hand side again, we're seeing underspends through those brackets, and you'll get full details on this page. However, it's important to note that these group of services received the lion's share of the COVID support grant that came in and was awarded by Cabinet last August. £1.7 million to get them afloat, because it's these services that had the real pressures around COVID and the COVID restrictions, and significant loss of income too. You're seeing at the bottom the carry forwards and the earmarking that's taken place, and they'll be taking place, they'll carry forward by heads of service and by services and utilised throughout the year. Members, at page 160, it shows the financial position for our health and social care and wellbeing service. You can see that, again, we have underspends, but it kind of masks a story. So the service essentially ended the year 2.107 underspent. But in the last days of March this year, the Scottish Government allocated substantial funds to partnerships. And the East Ayrshire partnership received £11.363 million from Scottish Government as a one-off amount of money. In addition to that, 1.568 of further COVID money. And so when that's added up, it shows that there's an underspend of £15 million within health and social care. Now, a vast sum of that is due to the timing of receipt of that money from Scottish Government. But it also shows that the money that's been given, that £11 million, has with it a whole number of conditions and requirements that is needed to be undertaken in the following year by the partnership. That includes supporting the private care home sector, who are still experiencing significant financial drain. And so we are actually providing money to support private business, particularly care homes. And at a time when restrictions have been eased and there's no longer a requirement for face coverings, the partnership are also buying substantial amounts of PPE, because for personal carers and the like, that requirement still exists. That's just some of the matters, the requirements they need to do with that money. But there's that. I think when you speak with colleagues in there, they'll accept and admit that the requirements and the asks of them in the year ahead will probably be far in excess financially of the £15 million that's been given. But it's important that the narrative around this is clear. In a year when the Health and Social Care Partnership are dealing with the Omicron variant, dealing with hospital admissions and trying to get folk out and into care homes and into the houses, and doing all that, then, you know, vast sums of work taking place during the year, and that underspend is due to timing that will be used in the year ahead. At the bottom of that page, we see as well that bottom table in the very last line on HBCT, that's housing benefit and council tax benefit, and we can see in the right-hand column an overspend of £324,000. So just as colleagues mentioned earlier, we're seeing families that are beginning to ask for some support, particularly in council tax. We're spending more in council tax benefit than we have for grant. And Julie Jameson and I have gone back to government to note that and get that money refunded to us if possible. What we are beginning to see is, as the Chair touched on, that real challenge in households across East Ayrshire. And, you know, that's why that £6.381 million I mentioned earlier will be required, not just for this year, but for years beyond too. And over the page, in page 162, we see an update on the housing revenue account. You know, that 2.256 of an underspend isn't really good news at all. The vast sum of that is due to vacancies, but it was a year in which the housing revenue account saw significant challenges. It had a plan in place to build houses and to modernise and refurbish existing stock, but the restrictions made that challenging, and the arrival of Omicron made that almost impossible. And so where they had plans for overtime and for work and for supplies and for subcontractors that would then generate income, all that had to be stood down. What wasn't stood down, however, was the work that was required. And so that £2 million that you see here as an underspend isn't really an underspend. It's money that's going to have to be utilised fairly quickly, because there's now additional work to be done on top of this year's work, because of the restrictions that were in place last year. So it's been a year of challenge for education, for all the services, but for education, for housing and for social work in the main. And if I can just maybe conclude by taking you to page 163 and just explain what this table is trying to do. It shows in the first line education. If we take you to the far right column, it shows that education ended the year at 3.531 of an underspend. But that underspend was only created after Linda and her colleagues called down £297,000 of money from the council to fight COVID. £233,000 of COVID grants were used, and £4.133 million of specific COVID grants for education were drawn down to. Essentially, the service had done. If we washed these out of the actual year-end amount, education would have ended the year £1.1 million overspent. But it's only by utilising all that COVID money that is no longer going to become available on the same scale that they were able to end that year in that position. So it's a year when it was a real challenge. It was a very confusing year in terms of what the numbers tell. We're sitting with services with overspent, with underspends, but I've got services who are exhausted, having fought COVID for the last 2 years. And so, Chair, I'm happy to stop there and take any questions on the revenue part.
Members, any questions, comments for Joe at this point? No.
So page 165 begins with the Pupil Equity Fund. Now, this fund is a fund that's allocated from Scottish Government direct to schools via councils. So we are told which schools have to be awarded. It's based on free school meals registrations, and we're told the name of the school and we're told the amount. That then is passed directly on to the head teacher for his or her management team to then use, and it forms an intrinsic part of the school improvement plan. I suppose, members, if I can take you just to page 166 and to the far right columns, which show the £582,000 and £978,000. When those two figures are added up together, that's a £1.6 million. You see that the head of education is carried. So at 31st of March, there was £1.5 million of an underspent in Pupil Equity Fund. However, as I said earlier, schools will continue to employ and work through to June, and so that first column, that second column, that £582,000 is payroll costs that will be used to pay teachers and classroom assistants in April, May and June. So that's spent. But schools have got an unearmarked amount of £978,000 that they require to spend. And, Graham, the head of education, assisted by her colleague, we're discussing this with Cabinet yesterday. There's real plans in place to support head teachers further to make use of this funds. They have their own dedicated plans through their school improvement plans. But members, it's also been a year when Omicron hit in the autumn and the winter, a time when we were thankful that we were not required to close full school. But there were many weeks where specific year groups and specific parts of primary schools were sent home, and that remote learning took place again. So it's in place and it's going forward. Members, in page 168, we begin to look at alternative delivery models, and these are essentially two parts. Ayrshire Roads Alliance, which is that partnership between the road service in East Ayrshire and the road service in South Ayrshire, managed by Kevin Braidwood, and East Ayrshire Leisure Trust, managed by Annika Friel. And just to note that in page 168, and you've been given a new page to replace this, these are underspends. These should have brackets around them, and I apologise for any inconvenience. But it's been a year when we're seeing underspends in Ayrshire Roads Alliance, and that's been made because they have staff vacancies. But it's also because both South Ayrshire Council and East Ayrshire Council bolstered those budgets during the year because there was a dramatic fall in parking income that just dried up, and so they were able to be supported through that means. And in Leisure Trust as well, the Leisure Trust saw dramatic changes taking place through the year as restrictions were placed on them. The last East Ayrshire Performance Report, they were looking to end the year at £100,000 overspent. By managing to find and secure external funding, and by looking at other uses of their budget, they've actually changed it entirely and came in, ended the year £455,000 underspent, and that will go towards their balances and be taken forward. And Chair, I'll just continue, if you don't mind, on to page 171, which is the Treasury section. Now, this committee receives a whole number of Treasury reports during the year, fairly complex documents that set out the Treasury function for the Council for the year ahead. And they're captured in very summary form in East Ayrshire Performs and in this page here. It shows the maturity of the loan debt and our debt portfolio, and it also shows the amount of money the Council has invested. And it shows £400 million of debt, the majority of that debt is with an entity called the Public Works Loan Board, which is an arm of the Treasury, where the public sector and local government is able to go and borrow at very favourable rates. And in terms of investments, we've got investments of £35 million. Those investments take place because we receive our grant funding each week, and there are periods where we don't need that. We've also got other funds put by, and we invest that in line with our Treasury strategy. And Chair, I'm happy to stop there in case colleagues have any questions.
Okay, members, any questions? Councillor Cogley.
Thank you, Chair. And Joe, thank you very much for the report. Joe, can I take you back to page 166, please, the Pupil Equity Fund? And should the figure here, the outstanding figure, should that be 0? Is that the target? Thank you.
Through you, Chair. In most cases, yes, but I recognise that there'll be some schools where the management team want to buy something fairly substantial that will take maybe a couple of years PEF money to make that happen. And so it's not unusual to see a plan in place that they almost save up to buy something in maybe year 2 or year 3. But in terms of the resources section, that right-hand column, in the main and for the majority of cases, yes, you would expect that to be worked down to 0 as we approach the end of the academic year in June, because in August a new amount comes in from government to start the new academic year. There has been disruption in PEF this year because of the restrictions that have been in place. We spent a fair bit of time on this yesterday at Cabinet, where the Chief Education Officer gave an assurance that not only will head teachers continue to be supported by colleagues in finance and ICT, people in culture and in procurement, and also the management team within education itself, but a dedicated piece of work will be undertaken to support head teachers to try and emphasise the need to utilise this funds in a perhaps a shared way, noting that, as it's listed here, although it's allocated to each school, schools are grouped in the locality, and so there may be a need for a discussion for a head teacher aided by Linda to say, you know, there is plans in school A that don't have sufficient funds, but school B in the same area does have, and the sharing of funds will produce efficiencies for education in terms of education attainment and the progression of the young people. So that's what Linda and Graham have undertaken to do, given the discussion yesterday at Cabinet.
Thank you. And if I could just come back on that, please. So the 978,303, is that figure being carried over, or will that be lost?
Through you, Chair, there's a mechanism within the PEF guidance that allows for carry forward due to unexpected events. And for the last few years, every local authority and every school who's had that underspend in PEF has been able to carry it forward from the Scottish Government. So it won't be lost, it'll be carried forward. It does, in a slight way, present a challenge to head teachers, because they'll have their new allocation, and then for some of the schools a substantial carry forward, but that's where Linda and Graham, supported by ourselves, will come in to assist.
Is that helpful, Sally?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Richardson, sorry.
No problem at all, Chair. Joe, it's just a quick question about the Treasury function, just the information we've just looked at in page 171. I noticed that of the 35.46 million, let's call it, most of it's invested overnight. Now, with my banking background, I know interest rates aren't great, Joe, but 87.6% of that money invested overnight. Does the council need that to be in an overnight call, or could more of that money maybe be invested in, say, 30 days notice in order to, you know, potentially get a greater return? It's just what's the explanation, Joe, for you know, 87.6% of those funds being an overnight call?
Thank you, and through you, Chair. With investments, we adopt a very prudent approach, and not just us, but it's through the thing called the SIP for Treasury Management Framework, where we have investments, they are invested for security, liquidity, and yield. So the first part is that the investment itself is secure. We involve for liquidity the ability to get the money back fairly quickly, and only after those two elements have been satisfied, they would then look at the interest rates. And that's for a whole number of reasons based on previous learning and previous issues that took place. So in terms of ourselves, we have a full range of counterparty lists that have been approved by the usual rating agencies and supported by recommendations from the Council's Treasury advisors who are linked. And so when it comes to the placing of those funds, although it's overnight, it's probably going to be overnight with a number of counterparties. We do have plans in place. So in terms of our capital programme, we're anticipating spend on that. So that's been factored in. But in terms of going forward, we do look at the amount that's placed in. It's mostly for 364 days, is what we put it out for, and two counterparties, both in the UK and abroad. But it's because there'll be a need for that money to come in some shape or form in the coming days or so. But it's something we keep on top of. The Treasury desk works at the beginning of each day to place and to bring back money that they've got invested or to undertake further borrowing. It's tied in, intrinsically tied into the capital section on this report in terms of the need for money to go ahead and progress that build. But it's something we do keep a note on, and you'll hear more about it as we go through, Councillor Richardson, the wider Treasury management strategies that you'll be asked to approve.
Again, thanks for that answer, Joe. And I know the mark or the difference between overnight call and say 30 days notice. It probably wouldn't be that much just now, but I just wondered why the percentage at 87.6% on overnight was quite high.
Yeah.
So as you're absolutely right, and it's about that second part, is about the liquidity and being able to access it quickly. And you know, if you're getting a minuscule addition to the interest rate, but it's tied, then you talk about the risk that's associated with that, and whether or not that's something that you would need to do going forward. But it's something that we look at. As I said, it's done every day, and you know, it's something that we base on that, as I said, that availability to bring that back if we need it against a marginal increase in that yield.
Happy with that, Councillor?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, thank you again, Joe, for that answer.
Okay, so the next section is a capital programme, and that's Simon Bell. Hi, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Good morning, members. Just maybe start by introducing myself. For those members I've not met, I'm Simon Bell, the Strategic Lead for Asset Investment within Facilities and Property Management. I thought I'd just begin by just giving you a brief sort of explanation of the capital section and how it's set out. So it's from pages 172 to 178. Hopefully it's fairly self-explanatory. We've grouped projects in relation to their specific type in different sections. There's some financial information around them and narrative that just gives an update on progress. And any issues with any projects are then reflected in the coloured column in the red, amber and green risk indicators. You'll also notice there's numbers in the coloured column, and they are referenced back to the RIBA work stage. That's the Royal Institute of British Architects. So there's a key at page 178 that just then identifies the stage that construction project is at. So just to kind of give you a kind of overview of things, the programme's making good progress just now. But as discussed earlier, it is facing a significant amount of challenge around about construction inflation and supply of materials due to a number of factors, including the impact of COVID, Brexit, the war in Ukraine and indeed increasing energy prices. So I didn't intend to go through the report in great detail, but if I could provide you with an update on a selection of projects just in relation to their stage of development. So there's approximately £50 million of construction contracts currently on site. And that includes restoration works at Dean Castle, which is nearing completion with handover anticipated mid-July. We have the refurbishment and extension to Crosshouse Primary School and Communication Centre. That's also well advanced. Completion anticipated a bit later in July. The new build near Third Primary School, which is progressing well. Steel frames complete, the roof's complete, and internal works are ongoing. We have a number of new build housing developments as part of the SHIP programme. That includes Witch Road in Kilmarnock, Millishields and Drongan, Bellevue Gardens, Kilmarnock, and Quarry Now, Auchinleck. And there's also early years projects as part of the 1140 hours expansion programme at Dolmellington, Fenwick and Catrin. Projects at technical design stage include the new Dunlop Early Childhood Centre, where market testing is almost complete and works are anticipated to start over the summer. We have the St Sophia's Enerfit refurbishment, where contract award is anticipated later this year, and the Galston office project, where planning consent's recently been granted and technical designs are being progressed. Projects in the earlier stages of development include the Doon Valley Community Campus. That's now restarted at the Reba Street Stage 2 concept design following recent Cabinet agreement to additional funding. And we're also progressing projects linked to the Ayrshire growth deal, which include the core project, where options are being explored to rationalise the design and reduce costs. And we have Moorfield Phase 3, where draft proposals are being developed at this stage, and also the Ayrshire Manufacturing Investment Corridor, where a project programme has now been developed and a design team is in place. So it's just a brief overview of some of the kind of highlights, Chair. Happy to answer any questions on these or any other projects in the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Just noting across house, it'd be good if that's handed over in time for the new term starting. Is that possible? Or do you think there'll be a delay in that?
That's the apologies, Chair. Yes, that's the current plan. It's facing some challenges, as I said, around about material supply issues, but it's currently programmed to be completed to allow the pupils back for the August term. We're monitoring it very closely.
And I think also the build at Witch Road, I think due to material supplies, I think that's been delayed as well. Do we know by Simon still? So, and just the house building programme at Witch Road, Simon, has that been delayed? Has that been put back a month or two due to the materials?
Yes, Chair. Apologies, my connection sort of broke up a wee bit there. Yeah, the Witch Road project did have some issues around about material supply. There was also some utility issues that happened on site that's delayed the project slightly, but that's scheduled to be complete by September.
Okay, that's helpful. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Simon? No, no. Okay, that's that. Well, thanks for your report, Simon. Thank you. We'll move on to people. Amanda, you take us through your report. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Morning, members. And for those that haven't met me already, I'm Amanda Lowe, the Head of People and Culture. The People pages start on page 180, and like similar to Simon, I only intend to pull out a few key points, but obviously happy to take any questions. So the first table on page 180 shows the breakdown of absence statistics, and the work days lost per employee for 21-22 is 12.02. That's an increase of 5.47 days lost per employee from last year, a significant increase. At the bottom of that page shows the breakdown of absence in both the short-term categories and the long-term categories. All the long-term categories have decreased from last year, but the short-term have all increased for last year. I think it's worth just noting there, obviously the figures last year were particularly low in some areas because of COVID and the restrictions, and as things have opened up, but they are higher than what they've been previously. I think it's just worth noting that at this point. Over the page in 181, shows occupational health referrals. Again, the occupational health referrals this year is more than double than it was last year, but the early interventions is less than half than it was last year. Physiotherapy appointments are half of what they were last year, and our employee counselling figures have increased than what they were last year. Again, it's just, I think it's safe to say that nothing is as typical as how we've seen it over the last few years. Things are very different. And just for members' information, from the People and Culture uncommitted balances, we've created a temporary HR officer post that's going to come in to do a project, to do a deep dive into the absence and see what other support managers and employees need, and we'll feed that back obviously at a later date. Over the page, on page 182, the first table there is disciplinary activity, and just to update that the one still under consideration at Health and Social Care Partnership has now been concluded and no further action was taken. The second half of that page starts with workforce planning, key performance areas. And the first table being the head count, which shows an increase in the year from the previous year of 196 employees. And the next table is the full-time equivalent, which shows a relevant increase with that. We then go on to our under 25s, obviously a key area for the council, and that shows that there was an increase of 93 employees under 25 in the last year, and Joe's obviously made reference already to the Jobs and Training Fund, and so far we've got bids in for 179 additional placements for those. The next table is the recruitment, just to give members an idea of the level of recruitment that's going on. We are starting, like very many other councils and other organisations, starting to struggle in some areas to fill posts, and we're looking at how innovative we can be about how we do that going forward. Page 184 shows the number of new employees to councils and the number of the council and the number of leavers, and then we've got some key performance indicators for our organisational development team, which shows the number of face experiences, coaching programme and spaces for listening, with some quotes. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Just on the vacancies, it's finding it hard to fill. Is there any reasoning behind that you know of?
It seems to be nationally. There seems to be problems everywhere. It's not just unique to ourselves. So some of the areas that we have been struggling with is the seasonal work, which we understand, but we're in the final stages, and hopefully by the end of this week or next week we'll be advertising posts. So we've moved the seasonal work from being created posts that will be seasonal in the winter with ARA and seasonal in the summer with outdoor amenities. So it'll be permanent posts that people can think, we're more hopeful that will attract, and then they'll move between the services. But particularly temporary posts, part-time posts, it's kind of across the board. Some of the specialised qualified posts as well, we're struggling in areas, but we're not unique, unfortunately. So we just have to keep working our best we can our way through it. And we've got a wee working group looking at different ways to advertise, social media, different things like that, just to promote best we can. We've included, I know, the adverts with flexible working policy and things like that as well, in the hope that that encourages.
That's great, thanks very much. And just to see as well that we've now got coronavirus included within the reasons for absence. And it's good to see the long COVID's been included there, because I think that's going to be pretty important moving forward. Does anybody else have any questions, Peter?
It looks like the table on page 180, that's over 14,000 days lost due to stress. So following the COVID pandemic, it looks like we've now got a stress pandemic. And I ask the council's strategy and how we're trying to deal with stress and hopefully bring that number down.
Through you, Chair. We've got a very tight policy, so it's monitored from employee to manager and right the way up to the chief exec. So we look at them all case by case. We've got a number of strategies in place, and I'm happy to share a copy of that policy with you with all the details. So we've got the early intervention in place with occupational health. We've got stress risk assessments. We work very closely with David Dorn's section from health and safety. We've got obviously the HR team support, the managers and the employees. We've got employee counselling. We've got CBT. We've got numerous strategies that we are we are very aware that the number is high, and we do work closely with that. But part of that post that I said that would come in for absence, we'll obviously look at that as well. We believe that we've got all the strategies in place, and we just need to make sure that they've been tightly monitored and supporting individuals going forward. Okay.
Thank you for that. I was also wondering how that compares with the private sectors. I'm working in engineering, and the numbers are significantly higher than what I'm experiencing in a factory in the engineering environment.
Through you, Chair, sorry. It's not something that we compare with the private sector. We obviously compare with other authorities and other government sections, and it is on par. And I think maybe just to put into context, for the last 3 or 4 years, he's not a good place to have a league table, but obviously there is a league table because it's a statutory PI. So for all our absence figures, East Ayrshire's normally in the top 3 of having the lowest absence rates across the 32 local authorities. So it's not something that we do within, as I say, private sector to public sector, though.
I think what's important to point out there, that although it's up to 14,000, we've got the supports in place, and we've got all the mechanisms in place to support our employees, and the know there's support available, and that's what's really important. So that's great. Does anybody else have any comments or questions for Amanda? Councillor Cogley.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Just back to the absence, you touched on comparing ourselves with other local authorities, and that we're usually one of the better performers. So bearing in mind absence rates for this last year, which are shockingly high, how do we compare with other local authorities in the last year?
Through you, Chair. So that the statistics for this last year haven't been produced as yet, but they're normally months in arrears by the time they get formulated and introduced. But the last year that was for 2021, we were 3rd in the league table for Scotland. So we don't yet have those new statistics. We've just submitted the figures into government.
Thank you very much, because I think that would be quite useful for us to know in due course. The second point I wanted to raise is in relation to vacancies, and you spoke about seasonal vacancies and outdoor amenities and seasonal vacancies in Ayrshire. So could you just tell us what you're planning on doing here? Because to me, that would seem like something that we should have been doing quite a long time ago, is combining those seasonal vacancies and making those permanent positions, but with the flexibility to move from one department to another. And if that greater job security is more attractive, then surely we should have been doing this many, many years ago. Thank you.
Thanks, through you, Chair. So yes, it's something that's been looked at, and to be perfectly honest, it's been put on hold with COVID to deal with the response in the first instance, but we're now at the position that we are looking at advertising, hopefully within the next few days, 10 posts that will work across. So yes, we could have done it earlier, but as I say, everything has been kind of pushed back a bit with the pandemic, and now we're in that position that we'll be moving forward to advertise those posts.
So thank you. But just to go back to outdoor amenities, I mean, I'm conscious that there's that we certainly appear to be massively under-resourced. How many vacancies do we currently have for seasonal staff in outdoor amenities?
To you, Chair. I don't have those figures to hand, Councillor Cogley, but there was an ask yesterday at Cabinet, and I'll circulate it to all members, of all vacancies in the council, seasonal and otherwise. So that will be circulated hopefully at the beginning of the week.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you.
Well, it's good to know it's under the spotlight and it's been dealt with. So that's reassuring, Amanda. So thanks. Councillor Richardson.
Councillor Richardson, I think you're on mute.
it's possibly a question that, you know, for the newbies, the new councillors to understand. But all of these vacancies across the council, Amanda, at the time of Brexit, how badly affected was East Ayrshire Council with you know, maybe employees who were European citizens deciding that they were going to, you know, head back to the continent, etc. Did that have a big impact in East Ayrshire Council? You know, foreign workers or European workers and Brexit, etc.
In answer to your question, no, it didn't have a significant impact in East Ayrshire at all. I'm not saying there wasn't the occasional post, but it wasn't anything of significance to ourselves.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. Thanks for that.
Okay, any more questions or comments for Amanda? No, you've got a hand up, Councillor Richardson. Is that an old hand?
Yep.
Okay, Amanda, thanks very much for your report. Thank you. And we're going to health and safety. Along to David.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, members. For any members that have met me before, I'm David Dorn. I'm the Council's Health and Safety Manager. What's before you is the year-end Health and Safety Performance Report. And if I could just draw members' attention to the top of page 186 of the summary report, you'll note in there that the number of the incidents reported to Health and Safety section is increased by 704 when we compare that to 2021, while the number of non-reportable incidents to HSE have decreased by 5 in that same period. And the 704 is a big figure. But to put it into context, I have to say that the coronavirus had a fairly large role in that figure, particularly in periods 2 and 3 and periods 12 and 13 that coincide with the start of the pandemic and lockdown, and also 12 and 13 where we saw the emergence of the Omicron variant of the virus. So I would just caution members that while that figure looks high, it's been seriously affected by the impacts of coronavirus and restrictions. If I could give you a more accurate representative comparator, just going back to the previous year, 2019-20, and using pre-COVID figures, there were 1,227 non-reportable incidents come through to us, and that's opposed to the 1,911 that we've had last year. So we saw a very slight decrease if we use those pre-COVID figures rather than the 2021. If I could draw members' attention to the bottom of page 186 of the summary report, you'll note there the incidents under the category of violence and aggression accounted for 63% of all the incidents reported to ourselves. It remains the highest cause of incident that we have reported. Just to give reassurance, we continue to work with all services and trade union colleagues to reduce the incidence of violence and aggression as far as possible. Just examples of that is that we meet every quarter with the Chief Executive Safety Strategy Group with trade union colleagues, and I also chair forum groups, for instance, in education, looking at violence and aggression specifically. If I could move to page 153, paragraphs 28 to 31 of the covering report, that outlines the work being done in mental health first aid training and also in our Here to Listen suicide prevention strategy and the training wrapped around that. So far, Chair, we've trained 110 people in mental health first aid and a further 170 people in suicide first aid. And these people are embedded right across our services and in our communities, providing support to people in crisis. Courses for both of those are organised each month up until December. They're proven to be very popular. The courses booked out up till September and October this year, respectively, and they're open to all elected members, communities and third-party organisations. This is just a demonstration of the commitment, as Amanda mentioned earlier on, in terms of mental health, that we place equal priority in mental health as we do on physical health, and this is a demonstration of that, Chair. And I'd be happy to take any questions on the report.
Thanks, David. David, just at the top of page 186, the dangerous occurrence under period 1 and period 8. Just a wee kind of summary of that.
Yeah, switch that on. I don't have the details sitting in front of me just now, Chair, but I could certainly get that. That's no problem at all.
Yeah, that would be fine. Thanks, David. Any questions or comments for David? Nope, nope. Oh, Councillor Watts.
Thank you. Looking at the report at the bottom of page 186, you've got three main causes, obviously violent aggression. Slips, trips and falls are obviously self-explanatory, but absconding, what is absconding sort of alluring to?
Through you, Chair, it's basically children who would get out of school. Yeah, true, yeah, basically. Yeah, that gets reported through sheet as well.
Okay, any more questions, comments? No. Okay. Joe, anti-complaints.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just go through the last two sections. The complaint section is fairly self-explanatory. It shows the complaints received in the period, and it shows how they were actioned together with the working days to complete, and whether that complaint was upheld, partially upheld, or not upheld. It's important to note that as a council, in the myriad of complaints we get, we follow the Scottish Public Sector Ombudsman's model for complaints, and that's really helpful in terms of the escalation process between stage 1 and stage 2. And at the same time, we take on board the learning from those complaints, and that's shown at the bottom of page 45 and overlay page 189 and over page 190 shows the duration of those complaints and the time taken to complete. Again, it shows a deteriorating performance in terms of taken to complete, but that's learning for ourselves. We're taking that forward. And again, you know, from my service in particular, what we are receiving now is some fairly complex complaints and complaints that may have been a while in the making and are now arriving in, and they're taking time to complete. Page 192 begins with the risk section, and as a council, you would expect we hold a corporate risk register. This is what is before you. It's built on from the service-based risk registers, which all maintain for services, and it shows here a number of risks, and it's, as I spoke of earlier, risks to the council's funding, risks to collected by the council, and risks to the demands and financial pressures placed upon our businesses and our local residents. They are shown as the first three. They're shown as red, and they will remain red into the foreseeable future. The narrative in terms of the overall risk has been updated to reflect most recent information. Just an information for committee in that risk 2B and risk 3, equal pay and open cast coal mines, will fall from the corporate risk register. We are including the external audit, which will deal with equal pay. We're not including, we're beginning to that audit process. And in terms of the open cast, there's been substantial work and funding that's followed that, as discussed in the narrative, that will see those two fall out of the corporate risk register. And just important for members to know that this risk register is and updated by council management team. The whole of CMT builds the corporate risk and updates it for each month and for each reporting period to stage performs. But that essentially, Chair, is the risk register. It concludes the stage performance report. The recommendations for your committee are on page 147, recommendation 3, which is to note the recommendation contained within the report, and also contains the recommendations to Cabinet yesterday.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Any comments or questions for Joe before we agree the recommendations? No. Peter?
I'm looking at risk page, is it 196? Hard to tell, it's blanked out. 10B, environmental climate risk. We recently had a big flooding event in Belfield, just off Hurlford Road. Is there a sum of money put aside to deal with future environmental risk?
Through you, Chair, there's not. That's what the general fund income for the balance sheet for it was so substantial. But where there's a risk, where there's a flood, for example, or a catastrophic event caused by a whole number of reasons, but say it's weather, then we respond to that and we spend balances and fundings to make that risk, to mitigate that risk. There's also a thing called the Belwyn scheme, which is a scheme open to local government in Scotland, where if there is a catastrophic event that requires an outflow of work and finances, then depending on circumstances, and I have to say the circumstances are fairly challenging to meet, but depending on circumstances, then there can be refunds from Scottish Government if it's a massive event. But for floods, there'll be a budget, overall budget within Ayrshire Roads Alliance, and that can be supported and augmented by other funds, depending on the scale of the event.
Okay, members, can we agree the recommendations? Thank you. Great. That takes us on to the next item. I'll just find it. So the annual review of all planning, enforcement and listed building consent appeal decisions and local review body decisions during the period 1st January 21, 31st December 21. David Wilson. Oh, David, sorry.
I'm just conscious of the time. There's 3 or 4 items still to go. So through you, Chair, it's just to ask whether you want to consider, members want to consider any short comfort break just now, or whether you're happy to crack on. It's really up to yourselves. I'm just conscious that it has been a couple, 2.5 hours, and there's still 3 or 4 items. 4 items I think still to go. So it's just to invite the consideration of the option.
Thanks, David. That's helpful. Members, do you want a comfort break or shall we crack on? It's entirely in your hands. Stay. Okay. We'll continue.
Yeah, I'm happy to crack on.
Okay. My enthusiasm, members. In terms of this paper, this is one of a suite of papers that we regularly bring to Governance and Scrutiny Committee in furtherance of the openness and transparency and accountability in decision making. And you'll see others in due course in relation to the outcomes of contracts and award of contracts. But in relation to planning, just to remind members from the induction session that in terms of the Council as planning authority and the delegation of the plan and function, decisions can be taken at 3 levels. They can be taken by officers, but never by a single officer in isolation, always within the team, with the input of the team leader and the oversight of the interim operations manager, David Wilson. The next level is a planning committee, which can determine most of the business, and then Council itself, by statute, requires to determine certain applications of national or major significance. And again, that's not the planning language, but that's the gist of it. In terms of appeals, if officers make decisions to refuse, then an appeal can go to the LRB. Those appeals also used to go to the reporter to the DPA, but since 2009 they've been dealt with locally, and that makes sense. It's usually the lower level applications, single extensions, gardens, houses in the country, that kind of a thing. So there's no point in clogging up the national appeals process, so that was dropped down to a local level. So the LRB considers appeals against individual officer determination, and the reporter appointed by the Scottish Ministers determines any appeals taken by applicants where either the Planning Committee or the Council refuse them. I'm conscious that this is kind of old hat now. We bring this once a year. Given the newness of most of the members, probably most of these decisions aren't may not be of any particular interest. I think the headlines are, and one of the other points we made as a takeaway is that what we try and do, and I fervently believe as officers our function, is to support every committee, every member, but as committees, as council, to make the best decisions you can in terms of the advice we give, the information we put in front of you, and our ability to justify and support the recommendations that we put in front of you. I think from this paper you'll see that in this occasion the reporter upheld the council's position in all 6 of the appeals that the reporter heard, and that's set out I think in paragraph 3, and at paragraph 5 of 7 cases determined, of 9 determined by the LRB, 7 were in favour or support of the original officer refusal, and 2 went the other way, which I think is healthy. I think if that's always 100%, people just see the local review body as perhaps a rubber stamping officer decision. So a bit of a divergence of views, particularly in planning, is no bad thing. The report also sets out details of the levels of enforcement activity that are undertaken, and although there's reference there to 2 of the enforcement officers, for the avoidance of doubt, the council has 2 planning enforcement officers for the whole of East Ayrshire, and they do get out there, they do respond to inquiries and complaints. I would simply ask that there's a degree of acceptance that the 2 of them can't be everywhere all the time, but they do get out and they do respond, and they are very thorough. So the enforcement activity that relates to particular actions taken by them is also summarised in this annual report. The decisions of the report are summarised in more detail in Table 1 and by the LRB cases in Table 2. I did have, and apologies to my colleague, I had asked him to be in a position to present this paper, but as I say, I'm conscious, one, of the length of the proceedings, and two, the fact that it's maybe of less relevance to the current membership in terms of the detail, but in terms of the process and the report we regularly bring to governance and scrutiny, hopefully it is of interest and will be in the future. Both myself and David Wilson are here, obviously, if there are any particular questions or points of clarification arising from the report, Chair. Otherwise, it's for noting.
Thanks, David. Any questions or comments for David? Okay, can we agree the recommendation? Okay, David, just on to the next item, derelict and dangerous buildings.
Thanks, Chair, and I will be bringing in my colleague to present this one, David Wilson, but just before I do, just to advise that as members, as you will all be aware, issues often arise in relation to buildings that fall into disrepair. What this paper deals with is those where the council actually, the deterioration is such that it triggers the statutory threshold for council intervention, either under the dangerous or defective buildings legislation or under other relevant provisions. And again, what we do on an annual basis is bring this summary report of where the complaints have been raised, buildings have been addressed, or other proposals have been put forward. What I would say is we will be shortly issuing a general briefing to all members based on one we'd prepared there, a bit like Blue Peter, but one we prepared earlier for local MSPs and MPs for a meeting with them on the same kind of issues. These are clearly issues of importance and concern to communities, and therefore to the community's local elected representatives, including yourself. So the purpose of the briefing, though, is just to give a clear, hopefully a clear statement of what the options are available to the council, because there is a gap between the statutory powers available to the council to intervene with buildings that meet that very clear statutory threshold of dangerous or defective, and buildings that are unsightly, unkempt, look poor, poorly kept, and particularly where they're in private ownership. So there is a potential always for this paper to become about the ones that we can't solve, but usually the ones we can't solve are in private ownership and aren't triggering the statutory thresholds. If they are in our own ownership, they shouldn't get to that state. And if they are triggering the thresholds, then there's no scope for excuses. We should be invoking the statutory powers and dealing with them as best we can. One of the other problems you have here that does arise from time to time, although the open cast case established in Scots law that when a company goes into insolvency, the liquidator cannot unilaterally divest themselves of onerous land. So the liquidator for the coal companies couldn't give up, just walk away and abandon, as the English coal companies were allowed to do in liquidation, the voids, basically the most onerous land we've ever had to deal with, that they left behind. However, that's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory for Scots heritable property law, because under companies legislation, if I run a limited company and that limited company owns buildings and I don't want to deal with all of that, I stop operating my company, I stop submitting accounts to Companies House, I stop ticking all their boxes, and after about 18 months to 2 years, they'll put out a dissolution notice. I ignore that. They'll put a notice in the Scottish Edinburgh Gazette telling anyone who reads it, which is nobody, that my company's about to be struck off unless anyone wants to object because my company owes them money or there are other issues. Nobody's aware of it. The company gets struck off. The company ceases to exist. They're no longer, a bit like the pirate in Monty Python, it's no longer in legal existence and its ownership has been extinguished. So what does that all relate to this? Well, one of the ones that used to feature in here, I've not checked if it's still in here because I think we've dealt with it completely now, was the former Conservative building at Sturrock Street, which was in private ownership by a company that had been struck off. So there was no owner, nobody to deal with the building. Eventually it was burnt down. We'd intervened then when it was dangerous because of the condition it was left in from the fire. We knocked it down, we incurred those costs, but under the company's legislation, we were able to apply to the courts, as we did in relation to the voids back at Grieve Hill and Garleffen, and assume ownership of the site. So at least we get some return on the investment in knocking down the debris. So there are a number of issues. The one in Townhead Street in Cumnock at the moment, that's part of the road closure scenario, is also got no legal owner. And there are 2 or 3 others where this problem can arise, which doesn't help. So that's just an added feature. So the position of the service and the council is we deal with these where we can. We try and respond when we're asked to do so, but we cannot provide a solution to every single problem where private owners are simply failing to maintain it because there is no commercial incentive to do so, because it's sitting empty and they don't have a tenant and they don't have an income source. So there are other forms of engagement. There are other aspects that the councils offer, the community-led regeneration team, the empty homes team, who try that positive engagement approach, as well as the more negative statutory enforcement approaches. So we do use a range and suite of approaches to try and engage with owners, but it has to be based in persuasion rather than imposition, absent any ability to legally threaten consequences if they don't maintain their own buildings. So that's a kind of potted history. And just to preview that what we will be issuing before the end of the week will be a general briefing for all members, just to give you the general background to dangerous and derelict buildings, wasteland notices, and where we have powers to act, as a starter for 10. And I would commend that to members if you are being approached by constituents or you have your own concerns about such buildings or sites. It's not just buildings, it can be vacant sites, whether they're council owned or not. But the backdrop there is, in terms of a handy hint of where we might be able to act or not, will be in the briefing that we'll share generally, just as a starter for 10. So with that, I was going to say introductory comment, I was maybe taking it up a wee bit, but with that comment, I would now invite my colleague David Wilson through your chair just to speak to some of the specific issues in the paper. Thank you.
David.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for that, David. That's a useful background. So I'll look to just try and kind of focus on some of the key points from the report, probably just reinforce or touch on some of the things that David's perhaps already touched on there, just in regard to that. So it's highlighted at paragraph 3, the properties detailed within the report include specifically buildings that are in a derelict and or dangerous condition, in which have either been subject to complaint or formal enforcement action. Buildings which are merely untidy in their appearance or land which is similarly untidy are not included within the report. Where the structural stability of a building is deteriorated to an extent where it is unsafe for persons frequenting the building or the public in general, the council has mandatory powers to undertake necessary actions to make the building safe under the Building Scotland Act. In respect of derelict buildings, enforcement action is discretionary under the Building Scotland Act and Planning Acts and may entail the council to fund any enforcement work that is not undertaken by the owner. 21 dangerous building notices were served by building standards in the reporting period to make an owner undertake works to return the building to a safe condition. On 15 occasions, direct action has been required with debt recovery pursued against the owner. 3 notable examples from the reporting period have been listed at paragraphs 6 to 12, including some long-term problematic cases such as Glazenut House and Denaskin Heritage Centre. Members should be aware that some of the problems stem from absentee or foreign owners where securing long-term solutions have been challenging, as noted by David. In respect of the planning side, the council has discretionary powers and may serve a notice on property that is adversely affecting the amenity of the area, which is often referred to as a wasteland notice. If that's not complied with, it could result in the council initiating direct action under section 135 Town and Country Planning Act, and then seeking to recover costs reasonably incurred by the council. During the reporting period, it's noted that from 14 specific complaints in relation to that type of issue in terms of untidy land, 1 notice was actually served. The details of that notice are explained at paragraph 14, part 1, noting that its use has largely been successful. 2 further successful examples are set out at paragraph 14, part 2, noting that both of those cases involved the serving of enforcement notices rather than wasteland notices due to unauthorised changes of use, both of which were appealed and subsequently dismissed by the reporter and reported on in that previous report. In one case, the land has been restored, and in the other, restoration should occur by the end of the summer, following an agreement to extend the time period for compliance. There are no outstanding notices on listed buildings. Turning now to paragraphs 19 to 29, these set out various plans and groups taking action or working collaboratively towards regeneration and reuse of properties and empty sites. This includes, for example, work with the Newcomer Development Trust in respect to the Castle Hotel and Trotters Building, the Darvel and Area Regeneration Team in respect to the former Co-op building to be transformed into a garden and market site. Another notable return to use of a derelict building is the former Grange Church in Kilmarnock, with phase 1 complete to convert it into the West of Scotland Climbing Centre, with the bouldering hall now open and the climbing centre due for completion in the autumn. In respect of debt recovery from direct action, paragraph 30 highlights that this is challenging due to the growing number of buildings which the owner as an individual or business reside or are registered out with the British Isles, and therefore any legal action requires to be administered in the country where the person resides or business is registered, resulting in quite a few challenges in that regard. Just in conclusion, it's noted that most of the matters in respect of potential derelict or dangerous buildings are actually resolved through active engagement and discussion with the owners, the building standards and planning, and that normally achieves the desired outcomes. Additionally, grant funding has been used to enable and help various groups and owners with this. In some instances, though, notices under the Building and Planning Acts as necessary to remove danger or to secure the improvement. The recommendations are set out at paragraph 2, noting the legislative powers available and the actions that have been taken. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. This was an interesting paper. I've never been on planning committee, so it was really quite interesting reading this, and I was familiar with some of the points, some of the kind of things that brought forward by elected members in previous years. Just in terms of the debt recovery, what is the value of the outstanding debt that's probably never going to be recovered within the council, if that's possible?
There's a couple of things. I don't have the total figure. We can provide that. Obviously, it varies from building to building, and it depends what the nature of intervention is. Sometimes when there's fires, it can be considerable. There's one in there at New Cumnor where they'd cancelled the wrong insurance, cancelled the car insurance rather than the house insurance. And it was the house next door that went up, and it was a neighbour's house that wasn't insured. So we then just need to step in. I mean, it's the policy motive behind the legislation is public safety. That's the kind of trigger for the council taking action. If a building's so dangerous or derelict, if it's dangerous and ready to fall down, then the cost could reflect the complete demolition and tidying up of the site. If it's derelict, it might just be shuttering the windows. So that's a kind of expenditure. It used to be we could apply a standard security, so if you incur greater costs, and you can again, but there was a gap for some reason in the legislation, so it was always an option to attach a standard security onto the building to try and recover, at least have a chance of recovering, because a standard security prevents the owner selling the building without clearing that debt. Then they took that away, but then they reintroduced it again. So we have the option of at least putting a security on. But if there's an example in there, for instance, one down in New Cumnor at Glacenuck House, which was actually a former council ownership, went out to a property developer, has been sold up, and the actual Glacenuck House itself is now, the last known owner is a deceased Chinese national, but apparently he owned it on behalf of a consortium. So we're in the position now of trying to get them to agree to sell it to back to a local developer as part of a housing development at just over half the price they paid for it, when there was a lot of activity on the part of the China in terms of their educational approach when they were setting up these centres. So I think what happened was a lot of property speculators and investors in China invested in buildings over here, think the Chinese government, when they were promoting their taking their curriculum around the globe on Chinese matters. They'll put that very well. Linda would explain it better, but there was an initiative which then didn't proceed. So a lot of folk invested in buildings that weren't then required for that Chinese government's national policy approach, and a lot of them have got their fingers burnt. So we're actually trying to promote a deal under threat of CPO to reacquire that. And in the context of that, the building's worth about 240, and I think as an example, that one we've just had to shutter, so it's sitting at around 16,000. But what I can do is I can provide the current information as an action following this, and it probably makes sense that we won't put figures necessarily against individual buildings, but to be fair, and what we find when we come to GNS, there's always room for improvement, and probably including a summary of what the kind of current costs is, or the expenditure that we've laid out in these buildings that we don't necessarily expect to get back. And there isn't a judgment of, well, do we think we'll get it back? We won't make it safe. We obviously always have to make it safe if that includes demolition. So it can vary from building to building, whether we're shuttering or demolishing or having to maybe put shoring up to keep it safe. Members will be familiar with the particular example nearer to the seaside over the border in South Ayrshire, where the former station hotel's costing them 60 grand a month on the buttressing just to hold it up, and they may not recover that. So we've nothing of the order of the station hotel, thankfully, but I'll provide the global figure that we had at the end of the last financial year, and we'll include that in future reports because it's a fair point, Jim.
Thanks very much, David.
Councillor Adams and Councillor Mabin, then Councillor Cogley.
Yeah, one for the two Davids, I think, Chair. With reference to the wasteland notice, is there a fee or a significant amount of money to try and track down who these owners? You made reference to the Conservative Club in Glesner. Is there a considerable cost in terms of time, or indeed just a cost to find out who the owner is?
There's a small cost. You can actually, anyone can do it, and there is that risk that we become that secondary source, but actually anyone can go into Registers of Scotland and register, and for a small fee you can get the title information. The caveat is provided that the last actual owner did record their title. So in most cases, no, it's quite easy to establish the last registered owner. Your problems arise if that last registered owner has either died or as a company has been dissolved and no longer exists. That's where problems arise. But actually identifying the last registered owner is simply a search in Registers of Scotland at the most basic level.
Councillor Mabin.
Hi, thank you. I suppose the biggest building in East Ayrshire is probably the multi-storey car park in the centre of town. I take it, did that come up in a previous report? And is there an update on what's going to be happening with that?
The multi-storey car park is obviously, because the council took the decision, it hasn't required, because the council as owners managing it, hasn't required formal building standards intervention. It has been examined by various engineers. It has been declared in non-technical terms short, and the decision has been taken by the council as a responsible owner to discontinue its operation. And the plan is, as you rightly said, is to demolish it. However, negotiations at the moment are continuing with the sitting tenants because we need to relocate them, the various bodies that had leases, formal legal leases that required to be negotiated out, and the relocation, and that seems to be well, let's just say it seems to be ongoing at the moment. Colleagues in Arran Estates are leading on those negotiations. So the multi-storey will come down as soon as we've relocated the tenants, and that's where colleagues are at just now in terms of still trying to finish off those negotiations and successfully relocate the tenants.
Okay, Peter.
I'm a bit confused what tenants you're meaning. Was it the Citizens Advice who were underneath it?
There's a few properties underneath on the ground level of the multi-storey. The Samaritans are in there, the Citizens Advice were in there, so there's 2 or 3 in there as formal tenants with a lease, and their bit of the building is obviously the car park itself, parts of that are no longer safe. So they're taking the view, well, the lease hasn't been frustrated, at least in one instance, because their bit of the building's fine. So in essence, we've got one of those charitable groups taking the not so charitable position that they'll take £270,000 off the council to relocate. So those negotiations are continuing at the moment. But yes, there are a number of tenants in the properties that sit below the multi-storey that need to be relocated before it can come down.
Thank you. And the shops and the foregate, I take it they're no tenants, but they're in a very dangerous place as far as demolition comes in the future.
I know that point has been raised, and that colleagues are quite clear that some of the multi-storey will require, that will come down to the methodology of the demolition, and some of that might require some of the nearest parts of it to be taken down by hand to minimise the risk, because the buildings in the foregate across the pedestrian way from the multi-storey are separate. They are not being relocated, and hopefully won't need to even be temporarily relocated, provided we manage the demolition in an appropriate manner that takes account of the close proximity of those buildings. I know from previous updates from Kevin Braidwood as the head of ARA that they're absolutely cited in that, and I'm simply sharing with you what I recall he confirmed the last time that came up, which I think included potentially removing some of it by hand, but certainly putting netting up, etc. So all necessary precautions and reasonable precautions will be put in place to protect the shops across from a multi-storey. I don't think anyone underestimates it's going to be quite a major engineering job to bring that down successfully without any adverse impacts on the surrounding businesses, but that's the mission.
Councillor Cogley.
Thank you. Just 2 points to raise, which I think are probably both for David Wilson. David, within Ward 6, there's a problem with a factory site or former factory site in Darvel, which I think probably needs fairly urgent attention. So I'd be grateful if myself, perhaps along with Beverly Clark, could speak to you later, please. And then secondly, just to refer back to paragraph 19, the empty property collaboration group. Now, I wasn't aware that this existed, and this looks excellent. And I suspect there are probably a lot of properties that aren't contained within this group, but perhaps could be. And I'd be quite interested in seeing what is currently part of the group from within my ward and suggesting some other properties that could perhaps be added. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. The factory site in Darvel, I know that Building Standards have already had involvement with, so it is a site that we're aware of, and certainly happy to speak to you about that with my colleague Hazel Whitelaw, who's the Building Standards team leader that has been dealing with that in the past. And for the property collaboration group, I'm sure we can put you in touch with relevant people to get you some detail of what's relevant for your ward.
Okay, thanks very much. So any other questions or comments for David or David? So can we agree the recommendations? Thank you. So the next item, the awarding of contracts, please, David.
So I think we missed the annual self-assessment, or have I got them in the wrong order?
So right, mine's are jumping. So this is the Governance and
Wishful
Scrutiny
thinking, Chair.
Committee.
Very
Sorry.
quickly, members, this came out of a previous look by external audit at some of our arrangements. So it was previously identified that while our Governance and Scrutiny Committee operates pretty much in accordance with the prescribed mode, if you like, for an effective audit and scrutiny committee, one of the elements that was missing was actually an annual self-assessment, which does what it says in the tin. That's a committee looking at how it operates, looking at its competence and capacity and its ability to deal with the business that's put in front of it. We did the first annual self-assessment last year, and then there was a follow-up this year. Going back to the discussion at the minutes earlier, we've established, I think, that only Councillor Cogley remains on the committee from that previous iteration. So we'll come back to you shortly, Councillor Cogley, for this minute. But the bottom line was that the first one created or led to the identification of a few actions in terms of further improvement. And it's that balance of not being held out or too concerned that if you identify an area for improvement, it then becomes source of criticism. Why weren't you doing it before? The council has a duty, a statutory duty, to actually deliver continuous improvement, which is no further defined than that. But you know, we can't live in a culture where people are fearful of making suggestions of good ideas for fear of being asked why they didn't come up with it sooner. So there is that element. So the first self-assessment was last year. The second one was in April this year, just before the election, and focusing on that one, you have the outcome from that. You have the note of the meeting at Appendix 1, and then at page 231 you have the actual summary of the consideration, the output from that session, and you can see what the previous membership of the committee made of that self-assessment, and largely, and we always talk about things not being a box ticking exercise, but if ever there was a box ticking exercise, it's this one where all the boxes are ticked. But you can see largely that it's mostly the right boxes that are ticked in terms of the committee itself. And this isn't officers telling you as members what we think. This is you as members doing your own assessment and identifying where there is room for improvement or other gaps or areas where we can put more in place. And largely speaking, the committee felt it was in a good place, but where it was noted that there was more to be done, then they were highlighted. So, for instance, there, one of the issues, and before we get into that debate, when it says at least one independent member, that is an invitation for the council's committee to consider appointing a member to GNS from outside the council. Obviously, we have independent or other individual members on the committee, in the form of Councillor Cogley, and apologies if I've missed anyone else. But that would be a matter that we haven't addressed. We've never had an outside appointment to the GNS because it's just never been thought about. It's never been asked and answered, rather than we took the decision not to. So at some point in the life of this committee, and we didn't think the first meeting was the right occasion, but at some point then that's a matter for consideration by this committee. I believe it's not for anyone else to tell GNS whether it should appoint an external member. And if you feel you could, then that would be a recommendation to council, because council still needs to actually make the appointment, but only on your recommendation. At number 15, there was an issue there, support the committee with briefings and training, a requirement or a request for more defined arrangements to be set out for induction and training of members joining the committee in terms. That was a specific point. One of the members who attended the second self-assessment on the 27th of April had only joined the committee in term, if you like, about a year before, and I think the support there wasn't the same as it might be in terms of the induction sessions at the beginning of the 5-year term. So that's an easy one for us to pick that up with any members who join this committee during its life. And over at number 19 and page 234, we were also to go away and report back on the value of seeking feedback from the public relevant parties and how that might cost effectively be done. Feedback's a good idea in principle. I think it's getting the connection between the business of GNS and any level of public interest therein. And then at 20, the last action from the last one was consideration, induction, ongoing training arrangements to further strengthen performance in this area and review progress as part of the ESA 2023. So that's the kind of meaty one. Our meeting's effective with a good level of discussion and engagement from all the members. And obviously that will vary from term to term, cohort to cohort. And I think that one would be for this committee, once it's found its feet, again, to consider for itself down the line. But anything we can do as officers to support training, not just collectively, but individual support and briefings, we're happy to do that. I go back to my primary point in all of this. Our function is to support you to understand the business in order to deal with the business, make best sense of the business, and make the best business decisions you can, whatever the situation. And that's what we're here to do. So that's the output. If you're happy just now, I wouldn't go into any more detail just now. We will bring back those which will require consideration by the committee a bit of, in the form of a short report and within the life of the committee. But none of these are considered to be massive priorities, but we will address them along with yourselves during the term of the committee and the council. So that's the self-assessment from April. And in terms of recommendations, if you're happy with that and subject to any questions or queries, Chair, members, then the recommendations are set out at page 226 to note the outcome, approve the updated action plan, agree that the process continued to be subject to refinement going forward, bring it to committee early in 2023 as part of the arrangements, and otherwise note the content of the report if you're happy to